The last seat. When Aaron Blake stepped onto Flight 447 with his daughter clutching his hand, he had no idea that the last two seats on a crowded plane would put him face to face with the system that destroyed him. 12 years ago, he tried to save lives by exposing a fatal design flaw. His reward? Silence, exile, and a blacklist that erased his career. Now, 35,000 feet above the Earth, that same flaw is about to turn a routine flight into a nightmare. And the only person who can prevent disaster is the man they tried to bury. Will the truth finally break through the turbulence? Or will the last seat become the last chance? Stay with me until the end of this story. Hit that like button and comment with your city so I can see how far this journey travels. The gate agent's voice crackled over the intercom with that particular blend of exhaustion and impatience that comes at the end of a long shift. Final boarding call for Flight 447 to Seattle. All remaining passengers, please proceed to Gate 17 immediately. Aaron Blake stood at the threshold of the jetway, his daughter Mia's small hand warm in his. She was 6 years old, wearing her favorite purple backpack decorated with cartoon airplanes, an innocent irony that wasn't lost on him. Her eyes were wide with the kind of excitement only children can muster for something as mundane as a 3-hour flight. "Daddy, are we really in the last seats?" Mia asked, tugging on his sleeve. "Looks that way, sweetheart," Aaron replied, managing a tired smile. His other hand gripped the handle of their single carry-on, everything they owned for this trip compressed into one weathered bag. He'd learned to travel light. Life had taught him that lesson the hard way. The jetway smelled like recycled air and industrial carpet. Aaron's footsteps were steady, measured, even as his mind cataloged details most passengers would never notice. The slight vibration in the floor, the temperature differential between the terminal and the aircraft, the ambient noise signature that told him what model of plane waited at the other end of this corridor. He already knew, of course. He'd checked the aircraft type when booking the ticket, a habit he couldn't break even after 12 years away from the industry. Boeing 737-800, registration number N4782W, built in 2011. Part of the next-gen series that had rolled out with such fanfare, such promise, such carefully buried flaws. Aaron's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Mia noticed nothing, chattering about the clouds they'd see and whether they might spot her grandmother's house from the air, a geographical impossibility given their flight path, but Aaron didn't have the heart to correct her. Let her have this. Let her have the wonder he'd once felt about aviation before it all turned complicated. The flight attendant at the aircraft door wore a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She'd been standing there for hours, greeting hundreds of passengers with the same rehearsed warmth. "Welcome aboard, straight back, all the way to the rear." "Thank you," Aaron said quietly, and stepped into the main cabin. The plane was nearly full, that particular sardine can fullness of a Friday evening flight. Passengers had already settled into their seats, laptops open, earbuds in, creating those tiny bubbles of privacy that air travel demanded. The overhead bins bulged with luggage, jackets, duty-free bags. Somewhere toward the front, a baby cried with the particular fury of disrupted routine. Aaron moved down the narrow aisle with practiced efficiency, his body unconsciously adjusting to the aircraft's dimensions. His eyes swept the cabin not with the gaze of a passenger but with something deeper, more analytical. He noted the emergency exit rows. Exits 12A through 12F, properly positioned. The condition of the carpet, worn but serviceable. The overhead panel indicators, all green. The slight list to starboard that suggested uneven fuel distribution or possibly passenger weight imbalance. Old habits died hard. Or didn't die at all. "Excuse me, sorry coming through," he murmured as he guided Mia past a businessman whose elbow protruded into the aisle. Row after row, deeper into the aircraft. Past first class with its wider seats and complimentary drinks. Past the extra legroom section where passengers had paid premium prices for a few more inches. Into economy, where the real world lived. Their seats were in row 37, the very last row, right in front of the lavatories and against the rear bulkhead. The seats that didn't recline. The seats nobody wanted. The seats that were left. "Here we are," Aaron said, hoisting their bag into the overhead compartment. The bin was nearly full, and he had to rearrange 2 other bags to make their luggage fit. Another passenger might have been irritated. Aaron was simply methodical, fitting everything together like a three-dimensional puzzle. Mia scrambled into the window seat with the boundless energy of childhood, pressing her face immediately against the plastic porthole. "Daddy, I can see the trucks, and the people with the orange sticks." "Those are called marshals," Aaron said, settling into the middle seat. The aisle seat remained empty for now, but Aaron knew it wouldn't stay that way. This flight was completely booked. Someone would claim that space soon. He pulled out Mia's tablet from the backpack and handed it to her, along with her headphones. "Remember the rules?" "Volume low enough that you can hear me if you call my name," Mia recited dutifully. "No games until we're in the air. Buckle my seatbelt tight enough that I can only fit 2 fingers under it." "That's my girl." Aaron fastened his own seatbelt, the click familiar and grounding. Around them, the final boarding passengers were finding their seats, shuffling bags, settling in. The flight attendants moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, checking overhead bins, offering assistance, preparing for departure. Aaron's eyes drifted closed for a moment. 3 hours. Just 3 hours, and they'd be in Seattle. Mia would see her grandmother for the first time in 6 months. They'd have a week of normalcy, home-cooked meals, bedtime stories in a house instead of their cramped apartment, maybe a trip to the aquarium if money stretched far enough. A week to pretend that life hadn't been fundamentally altered by a choice he'd made 12 years ago. A choice to speak up. A choice to do the right thing. A choice that had cost him everything. "Is someone sitting here?" Aaron's eyes opened. A woman stood in the aisle beside their row, one hand on the overhead bin, the other holding a leather briefcase that looked expensive but well-worn. She was perhaps 40, with dark hair pulled back in a professional twist, and eyes that held the kind of fatigue that came from too many flights, too many hotels, too many time zones crossed. "I believe so," Aaron said, checking his phone for the seat map. 37C should be occupied." "That would be me," the woman said, and there was something in her voice, a careful neutrality that Aaron recognized. The tone of someone used to managing information, to controlling what was revealed and what remained hidden. "Of course." Aaron stood to let her pass, his body pressing against the seat back to give her room. She moved with efficiency, sliding past him and settling into the aisle seat with the economy of motion that spoke of countless flights just like this one. She didn't speak again immediately. Instead, she stowed her briefcase under the seat in front of her, not in the overhead, Aaron noted, keeping it close, and pulled out a tablet. Her fingers moved across the screen with purpose, but Aaron caught a glimpse of what she was viewing: technical specifications, aircraft schematics. His pulse quickened slightly, but he kept his expression neutral. Maybe she was an engineer, maybe she worked in aviation maintenance, maybe it meant nothing at all. Or maybe, in the strange synchronicity that sometimes governs human lives, the last 3 seats on Flight 47 held more aviation expertise than the rest of the plane combined. The woman seemed to sense his gaze. She looked up, met his eyes for a brief moment. There was something in that glance, assessment, recognition of a fellow traveler who saw beyond the obvious. Then she looked away, back to her tablet, and the moment passed. "Daddy, when do we take off?" Mia asked, breaking the silence. "Soon, sweetheart. They're just finishing boarding." "Will it be bumpy?" Aaron glanced out the window at the sky. Clear blue, not a cloud in sight. Weather reports he'd checked obsessively for the past 48 hours showed smooth conditions all the way to Seattle. "Should be smooth sailing." "You always say that," Mia giggled, "and I'm usually right, aren't I?" "Usually," she agreed, turning back to her window. The woman in the aisle seat glanced over at them. Aaron felt her attention like a physical thing, though she didn't speak. Just observed, the way he'd been observing since stepping onto the aircraft. 2 people watching, measuring, cataloging details that others missed. What was her story? Why was she studying aircraft schematics on a Friday evening flight? And why did the particular document on her screen look like a maintenance bulletin for the 737-800 hydraulic system? Aaron turned his attention forward, trying to dismiss the questions. It wasn't his concern anymore. He'd left that world behind, or rather, that world had left him. He was just a passenger now, just a father taking his daughter to visit family. Nothing more. The cabin door closed with a heavy thunk that resonated through the airframe, the familiar sound of mechanical locks engaging, pressure seals forming. Aaron's body recognized these sounds at a cellular level, each one triggering memories he'd tried hard to forget. The lead flight attendant's voice came over the PA system. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome aboard Flight 447 with service to Seattle. We're just about ready for departure. At this time, please make sure your seatbelts are securely fastened, your seat backs and tray tables are in their full upright and locked positions, and all electronic devices are in airplane mode." Around the cabin, passengers complied with varying degrees of attention. The veteran travelers barely looked up. The nervous flyers checked their seatbelts twice. Mia pressed the button to make hers even tighter, then gave Aaron a thumbs up. "We'll be showing our safety demonstration momentarily," the flight attendant continued. "Even if you're a frequent flyer, we ask that you give us your full attention." Aaron had watched this demonstration thousands of times. He could recite it from memory, knew every gesture, every carefully worded phrase designed to inform without alarming. He watched anyway, because Mia was watching, and because somewhere in the back of his mind, the old training never quite faded. Know your exits. Count the rows to the nearest one. Note the oxygen mask deployment. Understand the brace position. Prepare for the worst, even when expecting the best. The woman beside him wasn't watching the demonstration either, he noticed. Her eyes were on her tablet again, scrolling through what looked like maintenance logs. Her brow was furrowed slightly, lips pressed together in concentration. Whatever she was reading, it wasn't casual airplane reading. The engines began to spool up, that distinctive whine that built from a whisper to a roar. Aaron felt it through the seat, through his bones. The vibration signature was normal. Port engine slightly different from starboard, but within acceptable parameters. The aircraft began to move, pushed back from the gate by the tug. "Here we go," Mia whispered, grabbing Aaron's hand. He squeezed back. "Here we go." The taxi to the runway took 7 minutes. Aaron counted without meaning to, old habits tracking time and distance. The aircraft turned onto runway 16R. He knew the airport layout by heart, and the engines powered up to take off thrust. The acceleration pressed them back into their seats. Mia squealed with delight. The woman beside them closed her tablet, stowed it, and gripped the armrests with white-knuckled tension that seemed at odds with her otherwise composed demeanor. Rotation speed. The nose lifted. The familiar sensation of wheels leaving pavement, of transition from one medium to another. The ground fell away beneath them, and Flight 447 climbed into the clear evening sky. Aaron allowed himself a breath. The hardest part of any flight for him was always the ground, the waiting, the boarding, the taxi. Once airborne, he felt strangely at peace, suspended in the element where he'd once felt most at home. The aircraft banked gently to the right, settling into its departure path. The seatbelt sign remained illuminated. Through the window, Aaron could see the city spreading below them, a grid of lights beginning to glow as evening settled in. Mia pressed her nose to the glass, pointing out landmarks real and imagined. "What's that building?" "I'm not sure, sweetheart. It looks like a castle." "Maybe it is." The woman beside them had released the armrests. She pulled out her tablet again, but didn't immediately open it. Instead, she sat very still, listening. Aaron recognized that posture. She was doing what he was doing, feeling the aircraft, sensing its behavior through subtle cues most passengers never noticed. The climb continued. 5,000 feet, 10,000. The engines settled into their cruise power setting. The wing flaps retracted with their characteristic grinding whir. Everything normal. Everything routine. 15,000 feet. The first vibration was so slight that Aaron almost dismissed it. A minor flutter in the airframe, there and gone in a heartbeat. He frowned, waiting, counting seconds. 20,000 feet. There it was again. Longer this time. A rhythmic pulsing that resonated through the fuselage, felt more than heard. Aaron's hand tightened on the armrest. His engineering mind immediately began cataloging possibilities. Hydraulic resonance, control surface flutter, engine imbalance, airflow separation over the wing. Or something worse. The woman beside him had felt it too. She'd gone very still, her eyes unfocused in the way of someone concentrating on sensory input. Their eyes met for the briefest moment, and in that glance, Aaron saw confirmation. She knew. Whatever she was, whoever she understood aircraft behavior well enough to recognize that something wasn't right. 25,000 feet. The turbulence hit without warning. Not the gentle bumps of atmospheric disturbance, but a sharp, violent jolt that sent unsecured items flying. A laptop clattered to the floor 3 rows up. Someone yelped in surprise. Mia grabbed Aaron's arm with both hands. "It's okay," Aaron said automatically, his voice calm despite the adrenaline beginning to flood his system. "Just some rough air. Perfectly normal." But it wasn't normal. Aaron knew the difference between clear air turbulence and this. The vibration pattern was wrong. The frequency, the intensity, the way it seemed to resonate through specific sections of the airframe. This wasn't weather. This was mechanical. The seatbelt sign, already illuminated, seemed redundant now. The flight attendants had stopped their service preparation and were moving quickly to their jump seats, their trained smiles replaced with focused professionalism. Another jolt, harder than the first. The aircraft dropped what felt like 100 feet, stomachs rising into throats. Mia made a small, frightened sound. Aaron wrapped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "Remember what we talked about?" he said softly, his lips close to her ear. "Sometimes planes bounce a little bit, like a car on a bumpy road. The pilots know exactly what to do." "I don't like it," Mia whispered. "I know, sweetheart, but you're safe. I promise, you're safe." Even as he said it, Aaron's mind was racing through scenarios. The vibration signature matched something he'd seen before, years ago, in testing data that had been classified and buried. A harmonic resonance in the hydraulic system that occurred under specific atmospheric conditions at specific altitudes. A flaw he'd identified. A flaw he'd warned about. A flaw he'd been told didn't exist. The turbulence continued, not constant, but rhythmic. Pulses that seemed to build and fade with disturbing regularity. Around the cabin, passengers were beginning to react with the full spectrum of human fear: white knuckles, closed eyes, whispered prayers, forced laughter, stony silence. Aaron looked at the woman beside him. She was staring straight ahead, but her hand had moved to grip the armrest again. Her tablet sat dark in her lap, forgotten. Whatever she'd been reading, whatever had brought her to this flight, it had just become secondary to the immediate reality of their situation. The captain's voice came over the intercom, carefully modulated to project calm authority. "Folks, this is Captain Stevens from the flight deck. We've encountered some unexpected rough air. We're working with air traffic control to find a smoother altitude. Please remain seated with your seatbelts securely fastened. Flight attendants, please be seated." Standard announcement. Reassuring without providing real information. Aaron had heard variations of it hundreds of times, but he'd also learned to read between the lines, to hear what wasn't being said. They were troubleshooting. The pilots knew something was wrong beyond simple turbulence. 30,000 feet. The vibration had evolved. Aaron could feel it specifically in the floor now, transmitted through the airframe structure. His mental database of aircraft systems scrolled through possibilities, eliminating and evaluating. The landing gear was retracted, so not that. The engine vibration felt symmetric, so probably not propulsion. The control surfaces. Another violent jolt. This one felt different. Asymmetric. The aircraft yawed slightly to the left before correcting. Someone screamed. Mia buried her face in Aaron's shoulder. And in that moment, Aaron Blake faced the question that had haunted him for 12 years. If you know something is wrong, if you understand the system better than almost anyone alive, if you have the knowledge to help but the world has made it clear your expertise isn't wanted, what do you do? Stay silent and safe? Or speak up and risk everything you've rebuilt? The turbulence intensified. The woman beside him was gripping the armrest so hard her fingers had gone white. Across the aisle, a man was clutching his armrest with similar intensity, his lips moving in silent words that might have been prayer or panic. 32,000 feet. Aaron closed his eyes. In his mind, he could see the hydraulic system schematic as clearly as if it were displayed in front of him. The primary lines, the redundant backups, the servo mechanisms that controlled the flight surfaces. And there, in the intersection of multiple systems, the vulnerability he'd discovered in testing. The harmonic frequency that could develop under the right or wrong conditions. The resonance that could cascade into something catastrophic. He'd written the report, documented the testing, presented the findings to management, and been told in no uncertain terms that production schedules couldn't be delayed for theoretical problems that existed only in computer models and academic scenarios. "These aircraft are safe," his director had said, standing in the fluorescent-lit conference room 12 years ago. "Your concerns are noted, but they don't reflect real-world operational data. We need you to be a team player here, Aaron." Translation: keep quiet. Don't make waves. Protect the bottom line. Aaron had pressed harder, gone over his director's head, compiled more data, written more reports, become, in the words of his final performance review, unable to distinguish between productive caution and obstructive paranoia. The termination had been quiet. No dramatic confrontation, just a steady erosion of assignments, increasing isolation, and finally, a conversation with HR about mutual separation and non-disclosure agreements and moving on to opportunities that better align with your communication style. The blacklist had been even quieter, just finding that every application went unanswered, every networking contact suddenly unavailable, every door politely but firmly closed. Aaron had rebuilt his life from scratch, new city, new career, technical writing for software companies. Work that used his analytical mind without requiring him to trust the aviation industry again. New identity, in a way. Just a dad. Just a guy trying to raise his daughter and pay the bills and forget that he'd once been someone who understood these machines at a fundamental level. 34,000 feet. The turbulence was constant now. The aircraft felt like a living thing in distress, shuddering and bucking against forces it shouldn't have to fight at this altitude, in this clear air. Aaron could feel the autopilot struggling, could sense the flight control system working overtime to maintain stability. He opened his eyes, met the gaze of the woman beside him. She was watching him with an intensity that cut through the chaos around them. "You feel it too," she said quietly. Not a question. A statement. Aaron hesitated, then nodded once. "The resonance," she continued, her voice barely audible over the aircraft noise and passenger anxiety. "In the hydraulic system. You know what this is?" It wasn't a question either. Somehow, impossibly, she knew, or suspected, or had been reading the exact documentation that Aaron had written over a decade ago. "Who are you?" Aaron asked. Before she could answer, the cockpit door opened. A flight attendant emerged, her professional composure visibly strained. Her eyes swept the cabin and stopped on their row. She moved down the aisle quickly, gripping seatbacks for stability. She leaned down, speaking directly to the woman beside Aaron. "Miss Rowan, the captain needs you in the cockpit, now." The woman, Rowan, didn't question. She unbuckled and stood, moving toward the front of the aircraft with the flight attendant. But before she left, she looked back at Aaron. "If this gets worse," she said quietly, "they're going to need you too." Then she was gone, making her way forward through the turbulent cabin, leaving Aaron alone with his daughter and the growing certainty that the past he'd tried to leave behind had just caught up with him at 34,000 feet. Mia looked up at him with wide, frightened eyes. "Daddy, what's happening?" Aaron pulled her close, feeling the aircraft shudder around them. Through the window, the sky was still clear, still beautiful, utterly indifferent to the drama playing out inside this metal tube hurtling through space. "I don't know yet, sweetheart," he said, and it was both truth and lie. He didn't know exactly what was happening, but he knew enough to be afraid. And he knew that very soon he might have to decide whether to stay in his seat and hope someone else could fix this, or stand up and become, once again, the person he'd been before the world taught him that expertise without politics was worthless. The turbulence pulsed again, stronger. The aircraft dropped and caught itself. Somewhere in the cabin, someone was crying. Aaron closed his eyes and did something he hadn't done in 12 years. He started running failure scenarios in his mind, calculating probabilities, evaluating options, preparing himself for a possibility he'd prayed would never come. The possibility that the last seat on this flight might be exactly where he needed to be. Not for himself, not for his career or his vindication, but for his daughter. And for the 183 other souls aboard Flight 447 who had no idea that the aircraft carrying them home had been built with a flaw that one man had tried to expose, at the cost of everything he held dear. A flaw that was now 34,000 feet above the earth, beginning to manifest exactly as Aaron Blake had predicted it would. The question was whether anyone would listen to him this time, or whether the last seat would become something far more final than just an unfortunate seating assignment. The seconds stretched into minutes, each one measured by the rhythmic shuddering of the aircraft. Aaron kept his arm around Mia, his other hand gripping the armrest as he mentally cataloged every vibration, every subtle change in the aircraft's behavior. Around them, the cabin had descended into that peculiar quiet that comes when fear overrides the human impulse to fill silence with noise. People sat rigid, waiting, hoping that the turbulence would pass, and normal flight would resume. Aaron knew better. The pattern was too consistent, too specific. This wasn't going to simply resolve itself. "Daddy, I'm scared," Mia whispered against his shoulder. "I know, baby. But remember what we always say about being brave. Being brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means doing what you need to do even when you are scared." "That's exactly right." Aaron kissed the top of her head, breathing in the familiar scent of her strawberry shampoo. Such a small, ordinary thing. Such a powerful reminder of what mattered most. The minutes crawled by. The turbulence didn't worsen, but it didn't improve either. It maintained that same disturbing rhythm, a mechanical heartbeat that Aaron recognized from simulation data he'd reviewed years ago. The kind of data that had been classified as proprietary, then quietly archived, then apparently forgotten by everyone except the engineer who'd compiled it. Movement at the front of the cabin caught his attention. The cockpit door had opened again, and this time two people emerged, the flight attendant from before and Claire Rowan. But Rowan's expression had changed. The careful neutrality was gone, replaced by something harder, more urgent. She was making her way back down the aisle, and her eyes were fixed directly on Aaron. She reached their row and leaned down, one hand braced against the overhead bin. Up close, Aaron could see the fine lines around her eyes, the tightness in her jaw. This was a woman carrying the weight of difficult knowledge. "Mr. Blake," she said quietly, and Aaron's stomach dropped. She knew his name, which meant this wasn't coincidence. "The captain needs to speak with you, immediately." Aaron's pulse quickened. "I don't understand, I'm just a passenger." "No, you're not." Rowan's eyes held his. "You're Aaron Blake, former lead systems engineer for the 737-800 hydraulic integration program. You wrote the technical assessment that identified catastrophic resonance potential in the servo control architecture. And right now, that assessment is manifesting in real time at 34,000 feet. The words hung in the air between them. Aaron felt Mia's grip tighten on his arm. Around them, nearby passengers were trying not to obviously eavesdrop, but the tenor of the conversation was impossible to miss. "How do you know who I am?" Aaron asked, though part of him had already begun to piece it together. "Because I'm Claire Rowan, Vice President of Safety and Compliance for Pacific Northwest Aviation. The same company that manufactured this aircraft. The same company that employed you 12 years ago." She paused, and something that might have been regret flickered across her face. "The same company that made a catastrophic mistake when it didn't listen to you." Aaron stared at her. Pacific Northwest Aviation. The company that had destroyed his career, blacklisted him from the industry, forced him to rebuild his entire life from nothing. And here was one of their executives on this aircraft, admitting that he'd been right all along. "Why are you here?" Aaron asked. "On this specific flight?" "I've been traveling to regional offices, reviewing archived safety documentation. Your reports kept appearing in my research. I've spent the last 6 months trying to understand why certain assessments were dismissed." Rowan's voice was carefully controlled, but Aaron heard the anger beneath it. 3 days ago, I found internal memos that made it clear your termination wasn't about technical disagreement. It was about quarterly earnings projections and production schedules. They silenced you to protect their timeline. And now that flaw is going to kill everyone on this plane, Aaron said flatly. Not if you help us prevent it. Rowan straightened slightly. The captain is a skilled pilot, but he's trained to fly the aircraft, not to understand its engineering tolerances at this level. The co-pilot is trying to troubleshoot, but the maintenance systems aren't giving them clear data. They need someone who understands the underlying architecture, someone who can predict how this resonance will progress. Aaron looked down at Mia. Her eyes were huge, filled with fear she was trying hard to be brave about. His daughter. His entire world. The reason he got up every morning, the reason he'd swallowed his pride and taken work that didn't challenge him, the reason he'd rebuilt a smaller, quieter life. I can't leave her, Aaron said. I'll stay with her. The voice came from across the aisle, an older woman, maybe 60, with kind eyes and steady hands. I raised 4 children, and I've seen my share of scared little ones. I'll keep her safe while you do what needs to be done. Mia looked at the woman, then back at Aaron. Is the plane really in trouble, Daddy? Aaron had never lied to his daughter. He wasn't going to start now. Yes, but I might be able to help fix it. Then you have to go, Mia said, and her voice was small but certain. You have to help everyone. The simple faith in those words nearly broke him. Aaron cupped her face in his hands. You are the bravest person I know. I'm going to go talk to the pilots, and I'm going to do everything I can to make sure we land safely. Mrs. Patterson, the woman across the aisle supplied. Linda Patterson, and your daughter will be just fine with me. We'll play a game or watch something on her tablet. Won't we, sweetheart? Mia nodded, already unbuckling her seatbelt to move to the aisle seat Aaron was vacating. Aaron helped her settle, then turned to Linda Patterson. Thank you, more than I can say. Just bring us all home safe, Linda said simply. Aaron stood, his legs unsteady from more than just the turbulence. Rowan was already moving toward the front of the aircraft, and he followed, gripping seatbacks for stability. The cabin felt longer than it had during boarding, each row a reminder of how many lives depended on the next few hours. Passengers watched him pass with varying expressions: curiosity, concern, hope. They didn't know who he was or why he was being summoned forward. They only knew that something out of the ordinary was happening, and in the contained world of an aircraft in distress, any change in routine felt significant. The flight attendant stationed at the forward galley stepped aside as they approached the cockpit. Rowan knocked twice, then opened the door without waiting for a response. Aaron followed her into the confined space of the flight deck. The cockpit was a controlled chaos of lights, displays, and warning indicators. Captain Stevens sat in the left seat, his hands steady on the controls despite the sweat beading on his forehead. The first officer occupied the right seat, his attention divided between the instruments and a thick manual spread across his lap. Both men looked up as Aaron and Rowan entered. The captain's eyes went immediately to Aaron, assessing, measuring. You're Blake? Yes, sir. Claire says you know this aircraft better than anyone alive. That true? Aaron glanced at the instrument panel, taking in the cascade of warnings and alerts. Hydraulic pressure fluctuations in System A, servo response lag in the primary flight controls, temperature anomalies in the actuator assembly. All symptoms he'd predicted, all ignored in favor of production schedules. I know this specific problem better than anyone alive, Aaron said carefully, because I'm the one who discovered it. The first officer looked up from his manual. We're trying to troubleshoot based on the fault codes, but the system's giving us contradictory information. Hydraulic pressure shows normal, but we're getting control lag that suggests otherwise. We've tried resetting the primary system, switching to redundant backups, even cycling the servo mechanisms. Nothing's stabilizing the resonance. Aaron moved closer, his eyes scanning the displays. The vibration he'd felt in the cabin was even more pronounced here, transmitted through the control yoke, the rudder pedals, every surface connected to the hydraulic system. He could see the oscillation in the control surface position indicators, small fluctuations that would seem minor to someone who didn't understand their significance. How long have you been experiencing the vibration? Aaron asked. Started around 15,000 feet, Captain Stevens replied. Minor at first. We thought it was atmospheric, but it's been building with altitude, and it's not responding to any standard procedures. It won't, Aaron said, because it's not a fault condition that the troubleshooting protocols account for. It's a harmonic resonance in the hydraulic servo system that develops under specific atmospheric pressure and temperature conditions. The higher you climb, the worse it gets. The first officer frowned. I've never heard of this failure mode. That's because it was classified as theoretical and removed from training materials. Aaron's voice was flat, matter-of-fact. 12 years ago, I documented this exact scenario during extended testing. The resonance develops when you have a specific combination of altitude, temperature, and hydraulic fluid temperature. It creates a feedback loop in the servo control system. The actuators start oscillating, which creates vibration, which increases hydraulic fluid temperature, which changes the fluid dynamics, which amplifies the oscillation. A positive feedback loop, Rowan said quietly. Exactly. And if it continues unchecked, the servo mechanisms will overheat and fail. When that happens, you lose hydraulic authority to the flight controls. All of them, because the failure cascade affects the entire system. Captain Stevens' jaw tightened. What's the timeline? Aaron looked at the temperature readings, doing rapid calculations in his head. Based on current progression and assuming constant altitude, you have maybe 45 minutes before you start seeing servo failures. Maybe less if the resonance accelerates. Can we descend out of it? The first officer asked. Descending will help, but not immediately. The resonance has momentum now. You'd need to drop below 10,000 feet to get into atmospheric conditions that would dampen it enough to stabilize. And even then, you've got compromised hydraulic systems that won't respond normally. Seattle's 2 hours away at our current position, Captain Stevens said. Even if we descend and slow down, we're still 90 minutes from landing. The implications hung heavy in the air. 90 minutes with degrading hydraulic systems. 90 minutes hoping the servo mechanisms didn't fail completely. 90 minutes gambling with 184 lives. What about alternate airports? Rowan asked. Somewhere closer? The first officer was already pulling up navigation data. Bozeman is 30 minutes southeast. Salt Lake City is 45 minutes south. Both have long runways and full emergency services. Aaron shook his head. You don't have 30 minutes at this altitude. You need to descend now and head for the closest suitable airport with the wind behind you. Captain Stevens made his decision with the kind of calm authority that came from thousands of hours in command. First officer, declare an emergency with center. Tell them we're descending immediately to 10,000 feet and need vectors to the nearest suitable airport. We'll take any runway over 8,000 feet with emergency equipment. Yes, sir. The first officer reached for the radio. Denver Center, Pacific West 447. We are declaring an emergency. Initiating immediate descent due to flight control issues. Request vectors to nearest suitable airport and emergency equipment standing by. The response came back crisp and professional. Pacific West 447, Denver Center copies your emergency. Descend immediately to 10,000 feet. Nearest suitable airport is Billings Logan International, bearing 045, distance 40 nautical miles. Runway 1028 is 10500 feet, winds 270 at 8 knots. Emergency equipment is being notified. Roger, descending to 10,000, direct Billings, the first officer confirmed. Captain Stevens began the descent, reducing power and lowering the nose with careful measured inputs. The aircraft responded sluggishly, the control lag visible in the way the flight controls moved versus how the aircraft reacted. What should have been smooth, immediate responses were delayed, mushy, fighting against the resonance in the hydraulic system. Aaron watched the descent rate, the airspeed, the hydraulic parameters. Every number was a data point in the larger equation of whether they'd make it to Billings before the system failed completely. The mathematics were brutally simple. Time versus deterioration. Distance versus control authority. Hope versus physics. Talk to me about landing, Captain Stevens said, his eyes never leaving the instruments. What am I going to be dealing with when we get there? Aaron pulled up a mental schematic of the landing configuration. The resonance will affect your flaps, your landing gear extension, and your speed brakes, everything that uses hydraulic actuators. You'll have to configure early and accept whatever lag comes with it. Don't make rapid control inputs. The system can't respond quickly and you'll amplify the oscillation. Like landing on ice, the first officer said. Worse, ice is predictable. This is a system fighting itself with every input you make. The altimeter unwound steadily. 28,000 feet, 25,000. The aircraft descended through the thin upper atmosphere toward the denser air below. Aaron could feel the slight change in the vibration pattern. Still present, still concerning, but marginally less violent than at higher altitude. Cabin crew, this is the captain. Stevens' voice over the PA was steady, authoritative, giving no hint of the crisis unfolding in the cockpit. We're experiencing a technical issue that requires us to land sooner than planned. We'll be on the ground in Billings, Montana in approximately 25 minutes. Flight attendants, prepare the cabin for an emergency landing. Passengers, please follow all crew instructions carefully. Through the cockpit door, Aaron could hear the muted sounds of the cabin crew moving into action. The safety briefing, the commands to secure loose items, review safety cards, prepare for brace position. Familiar procedures that most passengers hoped never to experience outside of routine demonstrations. 20,000 feet, 15,000. Hydraulic temperature is still climbing, the first officer reported. We're at 210 degrees and rising. Aaron checked the rate of increase. You'll hit critical threshold around 240 degrees. That's when servo failure becomes imminent. How long? Captain Stevens asked. At current rate of increase, about 30 minutes. Maybe 35 if we're lucky. The captain nodded. Then we'll make it work. First officer, get me landing data for Billings. Weather, runway conditions, approach options. I want everything. The first officer's fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up the information. Billings field elevation 4156 feet. Runway 1028 is 10,500 feet long, 150 feet wide. Grooved concrete in good condition. Current weather shows clear skies, visibility 10 miles, winds 270 at 8, temperature 42 degrees. We'll take the ILS approach to runway 10, Stevens decided. Gives us the most electronic guidance and the longest runway. I want to be configured by 5 miles out. Full flaps, gear down, everything locked in place before we're committed to landing. Aaron nodded approval. It was the right call. Configure early, accept the sluggish response, and fly a stabilized approach all the way to touchdown. No heroics, no last-minute corrections that the compromised hydraulic system might not be able to execute. 10,000 feet. The vibration had decreased noticeably, the resonance dampened by the denser atmosphere and lower altitude. But the hydraulic temperature continued to climb, the damage already done continuing to manifest in overheated components and degraded performance. Claire, Captain Stevens said without taking his eyes off the instruments, I need you to brief the cabin crew on what we're dealing with. They need to know this isn't a standard emergency landing. If we lose hydraulic authority on final approach, things could get rough. Rowan nodded. I'll make sure they understand. She looked at Aaron. You should stay up here. The captain might need you during the approach. Aaron thought of Mia, alone in the back with a stranger, probably terrified despite Linda Patterson's kindness. Every instinct screamed at him to go back to her, to hold her, to be there if the worst happened. But another part of him, the engineer, the professional, the man who'd tried to prevent this exact scenario, knew that the best thing he could do for his daughter was stay here and help guide this aircraft safely to the ground. I'll stay, he said quietly. Rowan squeezed his shoulder once, then left the cockpit. The door closed behind her, sealing Aaron in with the two pilots and the growing symphony of warning indicators. Where were you working when you discovered this flaw? The first officer asked, his eyes still on his instruments but his curiosity evident. Pacific Northwest Aviation. I was the lead engineer on the hydraulic integration team. Aaron's voice was without bitterness, just stating facts. I ran extended duration tests that weren't part of the standard certification process. Found this resonance pattern in the simulation data. Wrote a comprehensive report with recommendations for redesign. And they ignored it, Captain Stevens said. It wasn't a question. They called it a theoretical concern that didn't meet the threshold for production delays. My director told me the computer models didn't reflect real-world conditions. When I persisted, I was gradually reassigned, isolated, and eventually terminated for what they called inability to work collaboratively within team parameters. The first officer glanced back at him. That's corporate speak for, you were right, and we didn't want to hear it. That's exactly what it was. How many aircraft have this flaw? Captain Stevens asked. Every 737-800 built between 2011 and 2013 with the Mark 7 hydraulic servo system, roughly 300 aircraft worldwide. The captain's jaw tightened. And how many of them have experienced this resonance? According to official records, none, because it requires a specific set of atmospheric conditions that don't occur frequently, and because any incidents that did occur were probably attributed to turbulence or other factors. Aaron paused. But I'd bet if someone went back through accident reports with this failure mode in mind, They'd find unexplained control issues that were never fully resolved. 5,000 feet. Billings Airport was visible in the distance, a sprawl of runways and buildings against the Montana landscape. Emergency vehicles were already staging near the runway, their lights visible even from miles away. Pacific West 447 Billings Tower. You're cleared direct for the ILS approach runway 10. Emergency equipment is standing by. Winds now 280 at 10, altimeter 3012. Cleared for the approach, Pacific West 447, the first officer acknowledged. Captain Stevens began configuring the aircraft. Flaps 1. The first officer moved the flap lever. The flaps extended with agonizing slowness, the hydraulic actuators struggling against the resonance in the system. What should have taken 5 seconds took nearly 20. The aircraft shuddered as the flaps deployed, the changed aerodynamics fighting against the compromised flight controls. Flaps 1, green light, the first officer confirmed, but his voice held tension. They all felt it, the sluggishness, the reluctance of the aircraft to obey commands. How's the temperature? Stevens asked. 230 degrees and rising. 10 degrees from critical, maybe 10 minutes before the servo mechanisms started failing. 3,000 feet. They were on the glide slope now, lined up with runway 10, emergency vehicles tracking their approach from below. The airport was coming up fast, the runway threshold a clearly marked line they needed to reach before physics and mechanical failure intersected. Gear down, Stevens commanded. The landing gear lever moved. The hydraulic system groaned audibly as it forced the massive wheels out of their wells and into the slipstream. Warning lights flickered. The aircraft shook violently for 3 long seconds as the gear extended and locked. 3 green, the first officer reported. Gear down and locked. Flaps 5. Again, the painful slowness as the flaps extended further. The aircraft was a wounded bird now, struggling to fly with damaged wings, held aloft by the skill of its pilots and the aerodynamic principles that cared nothing for hydraulic temperature or corporate malfeasance. Flaps 15. 2,000 feet, 1 mile from the threshold. The runway filled the windscreen, solid and permanent and promising safety if they could just reach it. Hydraulic temperature 238 degrees, the first officer said tensely. We're at the edge. Flaps 25, full landing configuration. The final flap extension. The aircraft shuddered again, fighting, resisting, but ultimately obeying. The landing checklist was complete. They were configured, committed, descending toward the runway at 140 knots with compromised hydraulics and degrading control authority. Pacific West 447, you are cleared to land runway 10. Wind 280 at 12, gusting 15. Cleared to land 447. 1,000 feet. Half a mile. Aaron could see individual vehicles now, firefighters in their protective gear, ambulances standing ready, ground crew preparing for whatever came next. The aircraft crossed the runway threshold at 200 feet, still descending, still under control, but barely. Captain Stevens had his hands firm on the yoke, making tiny corrections, fighting the lag in the controls, willing the aircraft to obey. 100 feet, 50 feet. The ground rushed up to meet them. Hydraulic temperature 240 degrees, the first officer called out. 20 feet, 10 feet. Captain Stevens flared, pulling back on the yoke to raise the nose and transition from descent to landing. The controls responded sluggishly, the aircraft dropping faster than intended. They hit hard, the main gear slamming into the concrete with a jarring impact that sent shockwaves through the airframe. The nose gear touched down. Stevens deployed the thrust reversers and applied maximum braking. The aircraft shuddered, slowed, the runway disappearing beneath them at a decelerating rate. Emergency vehicles paced them along the taxiway, ready to intervene if needed. But they were down. On the ground. Safe. The aircraft rolled to a stop on the runway, and for a moment nobody in the cockpit spoke. Then Captain Stevens released a breath he'd been holding for the last 1,000 feet. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Billings, Montana. Remain seated while we're escorted to the terminal. Through the cockpit door, Aaron could hear the sound of relief from the cabin. Applause, crying, nervous laughter. The sounds of people who'd just survived something they hadn't fully understood but had felt in every fiber of their being. Aaron's hands were shaking. He gripped the back of the first officer's seat to steady himself. I need to get back to my daughter. Go, Captain Stevens said, turning to look at him directly for the first time since they'd landed. And Mr. Blake? Thank you. You saved a lot of lives today. Aaron nodded, not trusting himself to speak, and left the cockpit. The cabin was a study in contrast when Aaron emerged from the cockpit. Some passengers sat in stunned silence, still gripping their armrests as if the danger hadn't passed. Others were already on their phones, calling loved ones with voices thick with emotion. A few were crying openly, the release of tension manifesting in tears they'd held back during the crisis. Flight attendants moved through the rows with practiced compassion, checking on passengers, offering water and reassurance, maintaining the professional calm that was their greatest gift in moments like these. Aaron moved down the aisle with single-minded focus, his eyes searching for row 37. For Mia. Each step felt surreal, his legs uncertain beneath him as adrenaline gave way to the shaky aftermath of crisis. He'd been in the cockpit, focused on systems and calculations and the brutal mathematics of survival. Now, walking through the cabin, he was confronted with the human reality of what had almost happened. These faces, these lives. Every single one of them had been minutes away from a catastrophe he'd predicted 12 years ago. He reached the back of the aircraft and found Mia exactly where he'd left her, sitting beside Linda Patterson. She saw him, and her face crumpled, all the brave facade she'd been maintaining dissolving in an instant. She scrambled out of her seat and launched herself at him, her small arms wrapping around his waist with desperate strength. "Daddy," she sobbed into his chest. "I was so scared. I tried to be brave like you said, but I was so scared." Aaron dropped to his knees in the narrow aisle, pulling her into a fierce embrace. His own eyes burned with tears he'd forbidden himself during the emergency. "You were so brave, sweetheart, so brave. I'm so proud of you. I thought we were going to crash. Mrs. Patterson said we'd be okay, but I heard people crying, and I thought we were going to crash. But we didn't. We're safe now. We're on the ground, and we're safe." Aaron looked up at Linda Patterson over Mia's head, trying to convey gratitude that words couldn't capture. Linda's eyes were damp, but her smile was warm. She was wonderful, told me all about her favorite books, and her grandmother in Seattle, and her plan to be a veterinarian when she grows up. "Thank you," Aaron managed, "for staying with her, for keeping her calm." "We kept each other calm," Linda said gently, "and you kept all of us safe. I heard the flight attendants talking. You're the reason we're alive." Aaron shook his head, not ready to accept that characterization, and gathered Mia back into his arms. He sat in the aisle seat, pulling her onto his lap, despite the seatbelt sign still being illuminated. Right now, regulations meant nothing compared to the need to hold his daughter and feel her heartbeat against his chest, proof that they'd both survived. The aircraft began moving again, emergency vehicles escorting them toward the terminal. Through the windows, Aaron could see the full scope of the response they'd triggered: fire trucks, ambulances, emergency command vehicles, airport security, news crews already setting up their cameras. Flight 447 had become a major incident, the kind that would generate reports and investigations and questions that needed answering. Questions Aaron had tried to get people to ask 12 years ago. The intercom crackled to life with Captain Stevens' voice, steadier now, but carrying an undertone of exhaustion. "Ladies and gentlemen, I know that was a difficult experience for everyone. I want you to know that you were all incredibly brave and cooperative during the emergency. Once we reach the gate, please remain seated until we can coordinate our deplaning with the emergency response team. Medical personnel will be available if anyone needs assistance. On behalf of myself and the entire crew, thank you for your patience and your trust." The aircraft stopped at a remote stand rather than a regular gate. Through the windows, Aaron could see stairs being positioned, emergency personnel taking positions, airline management gathering with grim faces. This wasn't going to be a simple deplaning and continuation of travel. This was the beginning of something much larger. Claire Rowan appeared beside their row, and Aaron was struck again by how much older she looked than when she'd first sat down beside him. The events of the past hour had aged her, carved new lines around her eyes and mouth. She crouched down to Aaron's eye level, speaking quietly enough that only he and Linda and Mia could hear. "The NTSB will want to interview you," she said without preamble. "The FAA, too. This is going to become a major investigation, and your testimony will be critical. I'm not interested in testifying, Aaron said flatly. I did that once. It didn't end well. Aaron, this is different. An emergency landing with 184 people aboard gets attention in ways that internal reports don't. You can't be silenced this time. You won't be. I just want to take my daughter and go home. Rowan's expression softened slightly as she glanced at Mia, who was watching this exchange with wide, worried eyes. I understand. I do. But you need to understand something too. In about 10 minutes, when that cabin door opens, there are going to be federal investigators waiting to secure this aircraft and interview everyone involved. If you walk away without giving a statement, if you refuse to engage, you're giving the company the opportunity to control the narrative. Again. Aaron's jaw tightened. What narrative? We landed safely. Everyone's alive. Case closed. Is it? Rowan leaned closer. There are 300 aircraft out there with the same flaw. 300 planes carrying passengers who have no idea they're at risk. If you walk away, if this gets buried in technical jargon and corporate spin, how long until another crew isn't as lucky as Captain Stevens? How long until another engineer like you tries to warn someone and gets ignored? The words hit harder than Aaron wanted to admit. He looked down at Mia, who was still clinging to him like he might disappear if she let go. His daughter, his responsibility, his reason for choosing safety and anonymity over righteous crusades that destroyed careers. But what about all the other daughters and sons and parents on those 300 aircraft? What about their safety? I'll talk to the investigators, Aaron said quietly. But I'm not making any promises beyond that. That's all I'm asking. Rowan stood, her hand briefly touching his shoulder. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. For what happened to you. For what the company did. I wasn't in my current position then, but I'm in it now and I'm going to make sure this doesn't get buried again. She moved toward the front of the aircraft, leaving Aaron with his thoughts and his daughter and the growing certainty that his life was about to change again, whether he wanted it to or not. The cabin door opened. Fresh air flooded in, carrying the smell of jet fuel and Montana afternoon. Flight attendants coordinated the deplaning, starting with passengers who needed medical attention. A woman in her 70s who'd had a panic attack during the emergency, a man who'd hyperventilated so badly he'd passed out. Minor injuries, nothing catastrophic, but each one a reminder of the toll the experience had taken. When their row was finally called, Aaron stood with Mia in his arms, despite her being big enough to walk. He needed to carry her, needed the physical reassurance of her weight against his chest. Linda Patterson gathered her belongings and gave them both a final smile. If you're ever in Billings, you look me up, she said, pressing a business card into Aaron's free hand. I'd like to know how this all turns out. Thank you, Linda, for everything. They descended the stairs into the cool Montana air. At the bottom, a small crowd of officials waited. Airport security, airline management, federal agents with badges and serious expressions. And standing slightly apart from the others, a man in his 50s wearing a windbreaker with NTSB printed across the back. He approached Aaron directly. Mr. Blake, I'm Senior Investigator Thomas Morrison with the National Transportation Safety Board. I understand you were instrumental in helping the flight crew during the emergency. I provided some technical consultation, Aaron said carefully. Based on your expertise in aircraft hydraulic systems, expertise you gained while working for Pacific Northwest Aviation. Aaron's eyes narrowed. How do you know that? Miss Rowan briefed me while you were helping in the cockpit. She's been quite forthcoming about the history of this particular technical issue. Morrison's expression was neutral, professional, but Aaron detected something beneath it. Not hostility, but intense interest. I'd like to get your statement as soon as possible. Is there somewhere we can talk privately? Aaron looked down at Mia, who was watching the investigator with uncertainty. My daughter needs to rest. She's been through enough. Of course. The airline is setting up accommodations for all passengers at a hotel near the airport. I can arrange for someone to stay with your daughter while we talk, or we can wait until you've gotten her settled. I don't want to talk to strangers, Mia whispered against Aaron's neck. Morrison's expression softened. I have a daughter about your age. I know this has been scary. How about this? We get you and your dad to the hotel, make sure you're comfortable, And then your dad and I can have a conversation while you watch TV or play games. Does that sound okay? Mia looked at Aaron, seeking his approval. He nodded slightly. Okay, she said in a small voice. The next hour passed in a blur of logistics. Buses to transport passengers to the hotel. Luggage retrieval from the aircraft hold. Check-in procedures and room assignments. Airline representatives moving through the crowd with apologetic expressions and promises of compensation. Rebooking, whatever was needed to address the disruption. Aaron found himself sharing a bus with several other passengers from the rear of the aircraft. They recognized him as the man who'd been called to the cockpit, and questions came rapid fire. What had happened? How bad was it really? Were they ever in danger of crashing? Aaron deflected as best he could, giving vague answers about technical issues and skilled pilots, refusing to speculate or provide details that weren't his to share. At the hotel, Morrison had arranged for a family suite with a sitting area separate from the bedroom. A hotel staff member appeared with coloring books and puzzles for Mia, small kindnesses that felt significant in the midst of crisis. Aaron got Mia settled on the bed with her tablet and headphones, a familiar show playing on the screen. I'll be right in the next room, he told her. You can see me through the door. If you need anything, you just call out, okay? You promise you won't leave? I promise I won't leave the suite. I'll be right where you can see me. Satisfied, Mia returned her attention to the screen, though Aaron noticed she kept glancing toward the doorway where he'd be sitting. He joined Morrison in the sitting area, positioning himself where Mia could see him if she looked up. Morrison had a digital recorder and a notepad. He set them on the coffee table between them and leaned back in his chair. Let me start by saying this is an informal interview. You're not under oath. You're not being accused of anything. I just need to understand what happened up there and what you know about the aircraft systems. Where do you want me to start? Start with 12 years ago, with the report you wrote that identified this flaw. Aaron took a breath and began talking. He described the testing protocols he'd developed, the simulation data that had revealed the harmonic resonance pattern, the technical specifications that made certain 737-800 aircraft vulnerable under specific conditions. He explained how he'd documented everything, written comprehensive recommendations, presented his findings through proper channels, and he described what had happened when those findings were deemed inconvenient. Morrison listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker as Aaron detailed the systematic dismissal of his concerns, the reassignments, the isolation, the performance reviews that criticized his inability to accept collaborative input, the final termination that had been framed as mutual separation. Did you sign a non-disclosure agreement? Morrison asked. Yes, standard separation agreement with confidentiality clauses about proprietary technical information. And you interpreted that to mean you couldn't discuss these safety concerns with anyone outside the company. Aaron's laugh was bitter. I interpreted it to mean that if I tried to discuss them, I'd be sued into oblivion by a company with unlimited legal resources. I had a daughter to raise and bills to pay. I couldn't afford to fight that battle. Morrison was quiet for a moment, making notes. Then he looked up, and his expression had shifted to something Aaron couldn't quite read. You understand that NDAs can't legally prevent disclosure of safety information to federal regulators, right? You could have come to the FAA or the NTSB at any time. The words landed like a physical blow. Aaron stared at him, feeling something crumble inside his chest. What? Safety disclosures are protected. Whistleblower protections exist specifically for situations like yours. If you'd contacted us with this information, we would have been obligated to investigate, and the company couldn't have retaliated without facing significant legal consequences. Aaron stood abruptly, walking to the window, his hands clenched into fists. All these years of silence, of guilt, of wondering if he'd done enough. And there had been a path he hadn't known existed, a way to speak up that wouldn't have destroyed what little stability he'd managed to rebuild. I didn't know, he said, his voice rough. Nobody told me. And by the time I might have figured it out, I was so far removed from the industry that I convinced myself it didn't matter anymore, that someone else would find the problem, that the computer models were wrong, and I'd been overreacting. You weren't overreacting, Morrison said quietly. We're going to ground every affected aircraft until we can implement fixes. Your simulation data was accurate. The flaw is real, and today proved it can manifest exactly as you predicted. Aaron turned back to face him. How many incidents have there been that you didn't recognize? Morrison's silence was answer enough. How many? Aaron pressed. We're reviewing accident reports going back 10 years. So far, we've identified 4 incidents involving unexplained control difficulties in 737-800 aircraft that fit the profile. 2 resulted in hard landings with minor injuries. 1 resulted in a runway excursion that damaged the aircraft, but caused no casualties. And 1, Morrison paused, 1 resulted in a crash that killed everyone aboard, 73 people. The official finding was pilot error during approach in challenging weather conditions. The room seemed to tilt. 73 people. Dead because he'd stayed silent. Dead because he'd been more afraid of lawsuits than of speaking truth to power. That's not on you, Morrison said, reading his expression. That's on the company that silenced you and the system that made you afraid to speak. You tried to do the right thing through proper channels. When those channels failed, you were left with impossible choices. Choices that killed 73 people. Choices that saved 184 people today. You can't change what happened before, Aaron, but you can make sure it doesn't happen again. Aaron sank back into his chair, suddenly exhausted. Through the doorway, he could see Mia still absorbed in her show, safe and innocent and unaware of the weight her father carried. He'd spent 12 years trying to build a quiet life for her, trying to be enough, trying to make up for a career cut short and dreams deferred. And in one afternoon, that quiet life had shattered. What happens now? Aaron asked. Now we investigate thoroughly. We interview the crew, examine the aircraft, review maintenance records, pull the flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder. We'll be requesting all documentation from Pacific Northwest Aviation related to your original reports and the decision-making process that led to their dismissal. And we'll be asking you to serve as a technical consultant during the investigation. I can't afford to take that kind of time away from work. I have responsibilities. The NTSB pays consultants. You'd be compensated for your time and expertise. Morrison leaned forward. But more than that, Aaron, you'd be doing what you tried to do 12 years ago, making sure these aircraft are safe, making sure other engineers know they can speak up about safety concerns without destroying their careers, making sure the system works the way it's supposed to. Through the window, the sun was beginning to set over the Montana landscape, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Aaron thought about the other aircraft out there, still flying, still carrying passengers who trusted that someone had done the work to keep them safe. He thought about the engineers who might be sitting at their desks right now, looking at data that worried them, wondering if speaking up was worth the risk. He thought about Mia growing up in a world where safety took a backseat to profit margins and production schedules. I'll do it, Aaron said. I'll consult on the investigation. I'll provide whatever documentation and testimony you need. But I have one condition. What's that? This doesn't just fix the immediate problem. This becomes a case study for how the system should work. Transparent reporting, protected disclosures, consequences for companies that silence safety concerns. I want structural change, not just a patch on one aircraft model. Morrison smiled, and it was genuine. I was hoping you'd say something like that. The NTSB doesn't have regulatory authority, but our recommendations carry weight. If we document this properly, if we show the cascade of failures that led from your initial report to today's emergency, we can make a strong case for systemic reform. They talked for another hour, getting into technical details of the investigation timeline and Aaron's role in it. Morrison would need him to return to Washington, D.C. within the week to review documentation and provide detailed technical analysis. There would be formal hearings, expert testimony, collaboration with FAA engineers on developing the fix and inspection protocols. It was everything Aaron had walked away from 12 years ago, everything he'd told himself he didn't want anymore. And yet, sitting in this hotel room with federal investigators who actually wanted to hear what he had to say, he felt something he hadn't felt in over a decade. Purpose. The sense that his expertise mattered, that his voice carried weight, that speaking up could change things instead of just destroying them. Morrison eventually left, promising to send a detailed schedule and contact information in the morning. Aaron locked the door behind him and returned to the bedroom, where Mia had fallen asleep with the tablet still playing quietly beside her. He gently removed her headphones and turned off the device, pulling the blanket up over her small form. She stirred but didn't wake, lost in the deep sleep of childhood resilience. Tomorrow she'd have questions. Tomorrow they'd have to figure out how to get to Seattle or whether to return home instead. Tomorrow the real weight of what had happened would begin to settle. But for now, she slept, safe and whole, and that was enough. Aaron settled into the chair beside the bed, too wired to sleep despite his exhaustion. His phone had been buzzing periodically with notifications. News alerts about Flight 447's emergency landing, messages from his boss asking if he was all right, a voicemail from Mia's grandmother frantic with worry after seeing the news. He'd respond to all of them eventually. But first, he pulled up his email and began composing a message to the one person who'd started this chain of events by sitting down beside him on a crowded flight. The message to Claire Rowan was brief. Thank you for telling the truth. Whatever happens next, thank you for that. He hit send and set the phone aside. Outside, night had fallen completely, the hotel windows reflecting the warm glow of the room's interior lights. Somewhere out there, grounded aircraft were being inspected by maintenance crews who now knew what to look for. Somewhere, engineers were pulling 12-year-old reports out of archives and reading them with new eyes. Somewhere, the machinery of federal investigation was beginning to turn, grinding slow but inexorable toward accountability. And in this room, a single father sat watching his daughter sleep and contemplating a future he'd never imagined when he'd boarded Flight 447 that afternoon. A future where the last seat on the plane had turned out to be exactly where he needed to be, where silence had finally given way to truth, where the cost of speaking up might finally be measured in lives saved rather than careers destroyed. Aaron closed his eyes, listening to Mia's steady breathing, and allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things were about to change. Not just for him, but for every engineer who'd ever been told their concerns were theoretical, for every whistleblower who'd been silenced for threatening production schedules, for every passenger who deserved to know that safety came before profit. The last seat had become the first step towards something larger, something that mattered. And for the first time in 12 years, Aaron Blake felt ready to take that step. Morning came too early, sunlight streaming through the hotel curtains with aggressive cheerfulness that felt at odds with the weight of the previous day. Aaron had managed maybe 3 hours of sleep, his mind cycling through technical specifications and legal implications, and the sheer magnitude of what he'd agreed to when he told Morrison he'd consult on the investigation. Mia woke slowly, disoriented at first by the unfamiliar room, then remembering with a child's clarity exactly what had happened. "We didn't make it to Grandma's house," she said, sitting up in bed with her hair sticking up at odd angles. "Not yet, sweetheart, but we will. I need to call her this morning and let her know we're okay." "Can I talk to her too?" "Of course you can." They ordered room service for breakfast, a small luxury Aaron typically avoided, but that felt necessary this morning. While Mia worked her way through pancakes and orange juice, Aaron scrolled through the news coverage on his phone. Flight 447 was everywhere. Passenger interviews describing the terrifying turbulence and emergency landing, aviation experts speculating about possible causes, airline statements promising full cooperation with investigators, and buried in several articles, brief mentions of an unnamed passenger with aviation expertise who'd assisted the flight crew. How long before that anonymity disappeared? How long before reporters started digging into the background, finding the connection between the emergency and the engineer who'd been fired for predicting exactly this scenario? His phone rang, Claire Rowan's name on the screen. Aaron stepped into the bathroom for privacy before answering. "This is Aaron. I hope I'm not calling too early. I wanted to check on you and Mia before things get complicated." "Define complicated." Rowan's laugh was tired. "I've spent the last 12 hours in conference calls with our legal team, our executive board, and every regulatory agency that has jurisdiction over commercial aviation. The company is in full crisis mode. The media wants answers. The FAA wants documentation. The NTSB wants access to everything. And I'm standing in the middle trying to convince people that cooperation and transparency are the only way through this." "How's that going?" "About as well as you'd expect when you're asking a corporation to admit it prioritized profit over safety and destroyed a whistleblower's career to protect that choice." She paused. Our general counsel wants to offer you a settlement, a significant financial package in exchange for signing new NDAs and agreeing not to participate in the investigation beyond what's legally required. Aaron's grip tightened on the phone. Let me guess. 7 figures and a lifetime of silence. 8 figures, actually. They're very motivated to contain this. The number should have been tempting. 8 figures would change Mia's life, college fully funded, security he couldn't provide on a technical writer's salary. Every material concern addressed with zeros in a bank account, but it would also mean silence. Again. It would mean watching the investigation proceed without his full testimony, watching reforms get watered down in backroom negotiations, watching other engineers learn that speaking up still came with consequences that could only be bought off after the damage was done. Tell your general counsel I'm not interested in their settlement, Aaron said. I was hoping you'd say that. I told them you'd refuse, but they insisted I make the offer. Rowan's voice carried something that might have been relief. For what it's worth, I'm recommending full cooperation with all investigations. I'm also recommending that the company issue a public apology to you, acknowledge the validity of your original safety concerns, and implement new whistleblower protection policies. Will they listen to you? They'll listen to the alternative, which is facing regulatory sanctions, massive lawsuits from families of that crash Morrison mentioned, and complete destruction of their reputation. Sometimes corporations do the right thing for the wrong reasons. Through the bathroom door, Aaron could hear Mia singing to herself as she finished breakfast. The sound grounded him, reminded him what actually mattered. I need to get my daughter to Seattle. Her grandmother is worried sick and Mia needs some normalcy after yesterday. The airline is arranging transportation for all passengers. They're offering to fly you to Seattle this afternoon on a different aircraft, or if you'd prefer, they'll provide ground transportation or cover the cost of a rental car. The thought of getting on another plane made Aaron's stomach tighten. Intellectually, he knew the odds, knew that flying was still the safest form of travel. But after yesterday, the idea of trusting his daughter's safety to systems he couldn't personally verify felt impossible. We'll drive, Aaron said. It's what, 9 hours to Seattle from here? Approximately. I'll make sure the airline provides a rental car and covers all associated expenses. Rowan hesitated. Aaron, there's something else you should know. The media has started identifying you. A passenger posted a photo on social media showing you going into the cockpit. Someone recognized you from your LinkedIn profile. By this afternoon, your name will be attached to every story about Flight 447. Aaron closed his eyes, leaning against the bathroom sink. Privacy? Gone. Anonymity? Shattered. The quiet life he'd built over 12 years about to be dissected by reporters and internet sleuths and everyone with an opinion about aviation safety and corporate whistleblowers. How bad is it going to get? That depends on how you handle it. You can refuse all interviews, stay silent, let the investigation speak for itself, or you can control your own narrative, tell your story on your terms, make sure people understand not just what happened yesterday, but what happened 12 years ago. I'm not interested in being famous. This isn't about fame. It's about making sure other engineers know they can speak up. It's about showing that the system can work when people refuse to be silenced. Rowan's voice softened. I know this isn't what you wanted. I know you just wanted to visit your daughter's grandmother and live your life. But sometimes the universe puts us where we need to be, whether we choose it or not. Aaron thought about the last seat on Flight 447, the cosmic coincidence that had put him on that specific aircraft beside Claire Rowan on the day when theoretical concerns became life or death reality. Maybe it was random chance, or maybe there was a pattern to the chaos, a current beneath the surface that moved people toward moments that mattered. I'll think about the media question, Aaron said. Right now, I need to focus on my daughter. Of course. I'll have the rental car delivered to the hotel within the hour. Drive safely, Aaron. And thank you for everything you did yesterday and everything you're doing now. After the call ended, Aaron returned to the main room to find Mia had abandoned her breakfast and was standing at the window, watching the morning traffic on the street below. She looked small framed against the glass, and Aaron was struck by how much she'd grown while he wasn't paying attention. When had she gotten so tall? When had her face started losing its baby roundness, taking on the angles of the person she was becoming? Are we going to Grandma's today? Mia asked without turning from the window. Yes, We're going to drive there. It'll take most of the day, but we'll make it an adventure. We can stop anywhere you want along the way. Can we stop at that dinosaur museum? The one with the big T-Rex? Aaron smiled despite everything. If we can find one on the route, absolutely. They packed their single carry-on bag, checked out of the hotel, and found the rental car waiting in the parking lot as promised. A sensible sedan with Montana plates and a full tank of gas, keys left at the front desk with paperwork already completed. Aaron did a thorough pre-trip inspection out of habit, checking tire pressure and fluid levels and making sure everything functioned properly. Mia watched with patient familiarity, used to her father's methodical approach to anything mechanical. The drive through Montana was beautiful in the way vast spaces often are, all big sky and rolling landscape that made human concerns feel appropriately small. They found a dinosaur museum near Bozeman, spent an hour among the fossils, and reconstructed skeletons while Mia peppered Aaron with questions he mostly couldn't answer. They ate lunch at a diner where the waitress called them both honey and brought Mia an extra scoop of ice cream without being asked. Normal moments, simple moments. The kind of day Aaron had imagined when he'd booked the flight to Seattle, before hydraulic resonance and emergency landings and NTSB investigations had rearranged his reality. His phone buzzed periodically with calls and messages, Morrison sending the schedule for his consultation work, his boss expressing concern and asking when he'd be back at work, reporters who'd somehow gotten his number requesting interviews. Aaron ignored most of them, responding only to Morrison with confirmation that he'd be available the following week. They crossed into Idaho as afternoon shifted toward evening, the landscape changing from Montana's open spaces to Idaho's forested mountains. Mia dozed in the passenger seat, exhausted by the previous day's stress and today's museum exploration. Aaron drove in silence, his mind wandering through the labyrinth of what came next. He'd have to take leave from work, probably unpaid since he'd already used most of his vacation time. He'd have to find childcare for Mia during the DC trip, unless he could bring her along, which seemed complicated given the nature of the work. He'd have to prepare himself for the exposure, for having his past decisions examined by people who hadn't lived through them, who didn't understand the calculus of survival when you had a child depending on you. And underneath all of that, he'd have to confront the question that had been circling his thoughts since Morrison mentioned the crash. If he'd spoken up differently, if he'd been braver or smarter or more persistent, would those 73 people still be alive? The rational part of his mind knew that wasn't a fair question. The system had failed at multiple points. His employer had silenced him. Regulators hadn't known to investigate. Other engineers at Pacific Northwest Aviation must have seen the same data and chosen not to speak up. The accumulation of small failures and comfortable silences that enabled catastrophe. But the father part of his mind, the part that looked at Mia sleeping peacefully and imagined 73 other parents who'd never get to see their children again, couldn't quite absolve himself so easily. They stopped for dinner in Coeur d'Alene, a lakeside town with the kind of charm that made Aaron wish they were here under different circumstances. Mia revived enough to enjoy fish and chips at a restaurant overlooking the water, chattering about the dinosaurs and asking when they'd get to Grandma's house and whether they could go to the aquarium like Aaron had promised. "We'll do all of it," Aaron assured her. "Grandma's house, the aquarium, anything you want this week." "What about you? What do you want to do?" The question caught him off guard. When was the last time someone had asked what he wanted? When was the last time he'd even considered it, beyond the basic calculus of providing for Mia and maintaining their modest stability? "I want to spend time with you and Grandma," Aaron said, which was true but incomplete. "And I want to make sure what happened yesterday doesn't happen to anyone else." Mia considered this with the seriousness children bring to important topics. "Because you know how to fix the airplanes. Because I know what's wrong with them. Other people will do the actual fixing. But you have to tell them what to fix." "Yes." "Then you have to do it, Daddy, even if it's hard, because people could get hurt if you don't." The simple moral clarity of a 6-year-old. No concerns about career consequences or financial security or media exposure. Just the straightforward logic that if you could help, you should help. "You're absolutely right," Aaron said softly. "I have to do it." They reached Seattle near midnight, navigating through familiar streets to the modest house where Mia's grandmother lived. Margaret Blake was waiting on the porch despite the late hour, wrapped in a cardigan and clutching a tissue. She descended the steps before Aaron had fully parked, pulling the car door open and gathering Mia into a fierce embrace. "Oh, my sweet girl, I was so worried. I saw the news, and I couldn't reach your father, and I just kept imagining the worst." "We're okay, Grandma. Daddy saved everyone." Margaret's eyes met Aaron's over Mia's head, filled with questions and concern and the complicated love of a woman who'd watched her son-in-law raise her granddaughter alone after losing her daughter. "Come inside, both of you. You must be exhausted." The house smelled like Margaret's lavender sachets and the cookies she baked compulsively when stressed. Aaron carried their bag inside while Margaret fussed over Mia, checking her for injuries that didn't exist, offering hot chocolate and snacks and the kind of attention only grandmothers could provide. Once Mia was settled in the guest room with fresh pajamas and her favorite blanket from the closet where Margaret kept it for visits, Aaron joined his mother-in-law in the kitchen. She'd made tea, the ritual that marked every serious conversation they'd ever had. "Tell me everything," Margaret said, sitting across from him at the worn wooden table. "The news said there was an emergency landing, but everyone was safe. They mentioned a passenger who helped but didn't give names," Aaron told her. "Not just about yesterday, but about everything. The original reports 12 years ago, the termination and blacklist, the years of silence and rebuilding, Morrison's revelation about whistleblower protections he hadn't known existed, the crash that killed 73 people." Margaret listened without interrupting, her tea growing cold in front of her. When Aaron finally fell silent, she reached across the table and took his hand. "Sarah would be so proud of you," she said, and Aaron felt his throat tighten at the mention of his late wife. "She always said you had the strongest moral compass of anyone she knew, that you couldn't walk past something broken without trying to fix it. I walked past this for 12 years. No, you tried to fix it and were punished for trying. There's a difference between walking past something and being forcibly removed from it." Margaret squeezed his hand, eased his. "Now you have a chance to finish what you started. What does that look like?" "It looks like going to D.C. next week to consult on the investigation. It looks like testifying at hearings. It looks like my name and face being all over the media as the whistleblower who was silenced. It looks like complicated and public and nothing like the quiet life I've built for Mia." "And what does Mia think about all this?" Aaron smiled slightly. "She thinks I have to do it because people could get hurt if I don't. Her moral compass might be even stronger than mine. She learned from watching you. Even when you thought you were just surviving, you were teaching her what integrity looks like." Margaret released his hand and picked up her teacup, cradling it without drinking. "I can keep Mia here while you do what you need to do. She's registered at her old school for these visits. She has friends in the neighborhood. She'll be safe and loved, and you won't have to worry about logistics while you're dealing with everything else." The offer was generous, practical, and exactly what Aaron needed, but accepting it meant acknowledging that his life had changed irrevocably, that the investigation would consume weeks, if not months, that the quiet stability he'd built was gone. "Are you sure?" Aaron asked. "It could be a while." "I'm sure. That girl is the light of my life. Having her here is never a burden." Margaret's expression turned serious. "But Aaron, you need to promise me something. Don't lose yourself in this. Don't let the anger or guilt consume you. What happened to those 73 people wasn't your fault. What happened to your career wasn't your fault. The system failed. The company failed. You did what you were supposed to do. It doesn't feel like enough. It never does. But now you get to do more. And this time, people are listening." They talked until nearly 2 a.m, working through practicalities and emotions and the strange intersection of tragedy and opportunity. Eventually, Aaron made his way to the pull-out couch in the living room, surrounded by family photos that included Sarah's face smiling from frames scattered throughout the room. His wife had been dead for 4 years, cancer taking her with a swiftness that still felt unreal. She'd never know that her husband had been vindicated, that his warnings had been proven correct, that he was getting a chance to make things right. But looking at those photos, at Sarah's intelligent eyes and confident smile, Aaron thought maybe she'd known all along. She'd believed in him when he'd lost his job, when he'd been blacklisted, when he'd second-guessed every decision that had led to his professional destruction. She told him the truth always mattered, even when it came at a cost. Especially when it came at a cost. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by dreams of aircraft falling from the sky and cockpit warnings he couldn't silence. When morning light finally filtered through the curtains, Aaron gave up on rest and made coffee in Margaret's kitchen, watching the Seattle dawn paint the sky in shades of gray and pink. His phone showed 17 missed calls and 43 unread emails. The world wanted his attention, his statement, his story. Aaron scrolled through the messages with detached interest, noting which news organizations had found him, which aviation industry contacts had emerged from years of silence, which former colleagues were suddenly eager to reconnect. One email stood out from the others. The sender was listed as Jason Chen, with a subject line that read, "Fellow engineer, similar story." Aaron opened it. "Mr. Blake, you don't know me, but I know your work. I'm a structural engineer at a major aerospace manufacturer. 3 years ago, I identified stress fractures in a component used in regional aircraft. I reported it through proper channels. I was reassigned, then laid off 6 months later. I signed an NDA. I stayed silent. Last year, one of those aircraft had a structural failure during landing. No fatalities, but 27 injuries, some severe. I've been living with that knowledge ever since, wondering if I should have fought harder, spoken louder, refused to be silenced. Watching the news about Flight 447, reading that you're cooperating with investigators, gave me hope that maybe it's not too late, that maybe I can still do the right thing. I'm reaching out to the NTSB this morning. I wanted you to know that your courage is creating ripples. Thank you for speaking up. Thank you for showing the rest of us how." Aaron read the email 3 times, each pass revealing new layers of meaning. He wasn't alone. Other engineers had faced the same impossible choices, carried the same guilt, wondered if their silence had cost lives. And now, because he'd agreed to consult, because he'd refused the settlement, because he was willing to step into the light, others were finding the courage to do the same. The ripples Claire Rowan had mentioned, the structural change he'd asked Morrison to pursue. It was already beginning, spreading outward from one emergency landing to encompass an entire industry's culture of silence and complicity. Aaron replied to Jason Chen simply, "Contact NTSB Senior Investigator Thomas Morrison. Reference Flight 447 investigation. He'll listen. They all will. Thank you for being brave enough to speak up." By the time he awoke, Aaron had responded to Morrison confirming his availability for the following week, sent a brief statement to his boss requesting extended unpaid leave, and drafted an email to the reporters who seemed most legitimate. He wouldn't do interviews yet, but he'd provide a short written statement acknowledging his role in the Flight 447 incident and his intention to participate fully in the investigation. Margaret made pancakes, Mia's favorite. They ate together in the sunny kitchen, talking about plans for the week, the aquarium, Pike Place Market, maybe a ferry ride to one of the islands. Normal grandmother-granddaughter activities that would provide Mia with happy memories, while Aaron dealt with the decidedly abnormal work of unraveling 12 years of corporate deception. After breakfast, Aaron and Mia took a walk through the neighborhood, the familiar streets bringing back memories of visits when Sarah was still alive, when life had been different in ways both worse and better. Mia skipped ahead, pointing out houses she remembered, waving at neighbors who recognized her from previous visits. "Daddy, how long will you be gone?" Mia asked as they circled back toward Margaret's house. "Probably a week, maybe 2 for this first trip, but I'll call you every night, and you'll be having so much fun with Grandma that you'll barely notice I'm gone." "I always notice when you're gone," Mia said matter-of-factly. "But I understand you have important work to do. The airplane work." "The airplane work," Aaron agreed, "making sure they're safe for everyone." "Will you have to fly on one to get to Washington?" The question he'd been avoiding. The practical reality that consulting on the investigation meant traveling to D.C., which meant either driving across the country or getting on an aircraft. The irony wasn't lost on him. The engineer who'd predicted hydraulic system failures now had to overcome his own fear of trusting those systems. "Probably," Aaron admitted, "unless I want to spend 3 days driving each direction." Mia thought about this. "You should fly, because if you're scared and you do it anyway, that's being brave, like you taught me, out of the mouths of children." Aaron pulled her into a hug, marveling at when she'd become wise enough to throw his own lessons back at him. "You're absolutely right. I'll fly. And I'll think of you being brave yesterday, and that'll help me be brave too." They spent the rest of the day together, the three of them, doing ordinary things that felt precious in their simplicity. Margaret taught Mia how to make her special cookie recipe, while Aaron cleaned gutters and fixed a loose board on the back deck. Domestic tasks that grounded him, reminded him that life continued in small moments, even as larger forces swirled around them. That evening, after Mia was asleep, Aaron sat on Margaret's back porch with his laptop and began the work Morrison had sent. Preliminary documentation to review, technical specifications to verify, timeline construction for his original reports, and the subsequent dismissal. It was meticulous, demanding work that required the same analytical focus that had served him well as an engineer. But it was also cathartic. Each document reviewed was a piece of validation. Each specification confirmed was proof he'd been right. Each timeline entry was evidence that the system had failed, not him. Hours passed. The Seattle night settled around the neighborhood, quiet, except for the occasional car passing and the distant sound of a siren. Aaron worked steadily, building the technical foundation that would support the investigation's findings and the regulatory changes that needed to follow. Somewhere out there, 300 aircraft sat grounded, undergoing inspections that would validate every concern Aaron had raised 12 years ago. Somewhere, Jason Chen and perhaps others like him were making the choice to speak up, to trust that this time the system would listen. Somewhere, families who'd lost loved ones in that crash were learning that their grief hadn't been inevitable, that someone had tried to prevent it, that the silence Aaron had been forced into had cost more than just his career. The weight of that knowledge would never fully lift. But maybe, Aaron thought as he saved his work and closed the laptop, maybe he could transform that weight into something useful, into testimony that changed regulations, into a case study that taught future engineers they had protections and options, into a story that proved speaking up mattered, even when it came at a terrible cost. The last seat on Flight 447 had given him a second chance, not to change the past, but to shape the future. And sitting on his mother-in-law's porch in Seattle, preparing to return to an industry that had rejected him, Aaron Blake decided that this time he wouldn't waste it. The week in Seattle passed in a blur of aquarium visits and market walks and evening phone calls with Morrison that stretched long after Mia went to bed. Aaron reviewed hundreds of pages of documentation, his engineer's mind cataloging every piece of evidence that supported what he'd known 12 years ago. The technical data was irrefutable. The servo resonance pattern matched his predictions exactly. The temperature thresholds, the altitude parameters, the cascading failure sequence, all of it validated by Flight 447's emergency and the subsequent inspection of grounded aircraft. On Thursday evening, Margaret found him on the back porch again, surrounded by printouts and laptop screens glowing in the darkness. "You're going to burn yourself out before you even get to Washington," she said, setting a mug of tea beside his computer. "I'm fine. Just want to make sure I haven't missed anything." "Aaron, you documented this flaw exhaustively 12 years ago. The data hasn't changed. What are you really worried about?" He looked up at her, this woman who'd become more mother than mother-in-law after Sarah died, who'd supported him through grief and career destruction and the hard years of rebuilding. She deserved honesty. "I'm worried that even with all this evidence, even with 184 witnesses and grounded aircraft and Morrison's investigation, the company will find a way to make this go away. That lawyers will negotiate settlements and regulators will accept half measures, and in 5 years, we'll be right back where we started. Good people staying silent because speaking up destroys lives." Margaret pulled up a chair beside him. "You can't control what other people do. You can only control what you do. And what you're doing matters. That email you showed me from Jason Chen? That engineer found his courage because of you. How many others like him are out there, watching to see if the system protects you this time? That's a lot of pressure. That's leadership. That's what Sarah saw in you all those years ago. Not just the brilliant engineer, but the person who couldn't walk away from doing the right thing, even when it cost him everything." She picked up one of his printouts, scanning the technical specifications she couldn't possibly understand. "The work you're doing here isn't just about fixing airplanes. It's about fixing the system that breaks people who try to keep us safe. Aaron let those words settle, feeling their weight and their truth. Friday morning, he booked his flight to D.C. for Sunday, pushing past the anxiety that came with trusting his life to the systems he'd spent the week documenting failures in. Margaret was right about the irony. Mia was right about being brave. And Aaron was right about needing to be physically present for this work, not hiding behind cross-country drives and emotional distance. Saturday was his last full day with Mia before leaving. They took the ferry to Bainbridge Island, standing at the railing as Seattle's skyline receded behind them and the Olympic Mountains rose ahead. Mia pointed out sailboats and cargo ships and asked questions about how ferries worked, her curiosity as boundless as ever. "When you come back from Washington, will everything be different?" she asked as they walked through the island's small downtown, window shopping and eating ice cream despite the cool weather. "What do you mean? Will we go back to normal? Will you go back to work and I'll go back to school and everything will be like it was before?" Aaron considered how to answer that. The truth was, he didn't know what came after the investigation. Morrison had mentioned the possibility of a permanent consulting position with the NTSB. Claire Rowan had hinted that Pacific Northwest Aviation might offer him a role in their newly restructured safety division as part of their reform efforts. Other aerospace companies had reached out through intermediaries, feeling out his interest in positions that would use his expertise without the baggage of his history. But all of that was speculation, possibilities that might or might not materialize depending on how the next few weeks unfolded. "I think some things will be different," Aaron said carefully. "But the important things, you and me, Grandma, our life together, those won't change. I promise you that." "But you might have a different job?" "Maybe. Would that bother you?" Mia licked her ice cream thoughtfully. "Only if it made you sad. Your old job made you sad sometimes. I could tell even when you tried to hide it. You didn't like the work very much." The observation startled him. He thought he'd hidden his dissatisfaction better, thought he'd successfully compartmentalized the gap between what he was capable of and what he'd been relegated to doing. Apparently, 6-year-olds were more perceptive than he'd given them credit for. "You're right, I didn't love it, but it paid our bills and let me be home with you every evening, and that mattered more than loving every minute of my work." "But what if you could do both? Have a job you love and still be home with me?" "Then that would be pretty perfect, wouldn't it?" They caught the late afternoon ferry back to Seattle, the city lights beginning to glow as dusk settled over Puget Sound. Aaron held Mia's hand as they stood at the railing, watching the skyline grow closer, and felt something shift inside him. Fear giving way to possibility, anxiety transforming into cautious hope, the future unknown but no longer threatening. Sunday morning came with gray skies and rain, quintessentially Seattle weather that made leaving feel appropriately melancholy. Aaron packed his single bag while Mia helped, folding his shirts with the careful concentration she brought to important tasks. Margaret made a big breakfast, the kind meant to fortify travelers and provide comfort through abundance. At the airport, Mia hugged him fiercely. "Remember to be brave," she whispered against his chest. "I will. And you remember that I love you more than anything in the world." "Even more than airplanes?" "Even more than airplanes." Margaret walked him to the security checkpoint, her hand briefly squeezing his arm. "Call when you land. And Aaron? Make them listen. Not just for you or for those 73 people, but for every engineer who comes after you." The flight to D.C. was uneventful in the best possible way. Aaron spent it reviewing notes and preparing mentally for the week ahead. The man beside him tried to make conversation but gave up after receiving monosyllabic responses. Aaron felt mildly guilty about his unfriendliness, but the alternative was explaining that he was the whistleblower from Flight 447, and he wasn't ready for that conversation with strangers. Morrison met him at baggage claim, looking exactly like his voice suggested, solid, competent, utterly reliable. They shook hands, and Morrison drove him to a hotel near the NTSB offices, briefing him on the week's schedule along the way. "Monday and Tuesday, you'll be working with our technical team, walking through your original findings and comparing them to the data we've gathered from Flight 447 and the grounded aircraft inspections. Wednesday is testimony to the investigative board. Thursday, you'll meet with FAA engineers who are developing the inspection protocols and retrofit requirements. Friday is reserved for follow-up and documentation. What happens after this week?" That depends on what we find and what the FAA decides. But Aaron, I'm going to be straight with you. The evidence is overwhelming. Every aircraft we've inspected shows some degree of servo wear consistent with your predicted resonance pattern. We found maintenance logs documenting unexplained vibrations that were dismissed as normal operational variations. We found internal company emails from 6 years ago where engineers mentioned your old reports and were told to stop raising concerns that had been previously addressed and closed. Aaron's hands tightened on his knees. They knew. Even years later, people inside the company knew and were silenced. They knew. And they're going to have to answer for it. The FAA is considering substantial fines. The Department of Justice is reviewing the case for potential criminal charges related to falsifying safety documentation. And the families from that crash have filed a wrongful death lawsuit that specifically cites your original reports as evidence the company had knowledge of the defect. The hotel was a standard business traveler setup, efficient and impersonal. Morrison helped him check in, then handed him a thick folder of materials to review before morning. Get some rest. Tomorrow starts early. Morrison paused at the door. And Aaron, thank you for doing this. I know it's not easy coming back to a field that treated you so badly, but what you're doing matters. It really matters. Alone in the hotel room, Aaron ordered room service and spread the folder's contents across the desk. Technical reports, email chains, testimony transcripts from other engineers who'd finally found the courage to speak. Each document was another piece of the larger picture, another thread in the web of institutional failure that had enabled disaster. He called Mia before she went to bed, listening to her chatter about her day at her old school, reconnecting with friends she only saw during Seattle visits. Her voice was bright, unburdened by the weight Aaron carried. That was as it should be. She'd have plenty of time to learn about the complicated moral mathematics of adult life. For now, she could just be 6 years old, excited about recess and art class and the new library books Grandma had checked out. Monday morning, Aaron entered the NTSB offices with his visitor badge and security clearance, feeling like an imposter despite Morrison's assurances. But the technical team greeted him not as an outsider but as a colleague, someone whose expertise they genuinely valued. They spent 8 hours going through servo mechanism analysis, comparing his 12-year-old simulation data to current physical evidence from disassembled components. The wear patterns are exactly what you predicted, one engineer said, showing Aaron microscopic images of scored metal and degraded seals. The resonance creates heat concentration at these specific points, which accelerates deterioration beyond normal operational parameters. In another 6 months of service, Flight 447 servos would have failed catastrophically, regardless of the emergency landing. The words should have felt like vindication. Instead, they felt like confirmation of a tragedy narrowly avoided. Aaron thought about all the other flights in those 6 months, all the passengers who'd never known how close they'd come to disaster. Tuesday brought more of the same, drilling down into hydraulic fluid dynamics and temperature curves and failure probability calculations. Aaron's engineering mind engaged fully, the work familiar and challenging in ways he'd missed. This was what he was built for, not writing user manuals for software products, but solving complex technical problems that had real stakes attached to them. Wednesday morning arrived with the weight of formal testimony. Aaron dressed in the one suit he'd brought, looking at himself in the hotel mirror and barely recognizing the person staring back. 12 years ago, he'd worn suits every day, presented to executives and engineering boards, carried himself with the confidence of someone whose expertise was valued. That person had been dismantled piece by piece until only the essentials remained: father, survivor, man doing whatever work would pay the bills. Now, standing in this DC hotel room, Aaron felt that former self beginning to reemerge. Not the naive engineer who'd believed truth was sufficient defense against institutional pressure, but someone harder, wiser, more aware of the costs and more determined to make them worthwhile. The testimony took place in a conference room filled with NTSB board members, FAA representatives, congressional staffers, and legal observers from multiple entities. Aaron was sworn in despite this being an investigative hearing rather than a legal proceeding, the formality adding weight to the proceedings. Morrison led him through the timeline chronologically. The testing protocols Aaron had developed, the simulation data showing resonance potential, The comprehensive report he'd written with specific recommendations for design modifications, the response from management, the gradual isolation and eventual termination, the NDA he'd signed, believing he had no other options. Mr. Blake, you've stated that you believe the non-disclosure agreement prevented you from reporting your safety concerns to federal regulators. Is that correct? Yes. I was told by company legal counsel that disclosing proprietary technical information to anyone outside the company would result in immediate legal action. I had a young daughter and limited financial resources. I couldn't risk a lawsuit I had no way of winning. Were you aware at that time that safety disclosures to federal agencies are protected under whistleblower statutes? Aaron's voice was steady. No, I was not aware of that protection. If I had been, I would have contacted the NTSB immediately after my termination. One of the FAA representatives leaned forward. Mr. Blake, in your professional opinion, would implementation of your recommended design modifications in 2013 have prevented the servo failures we're now seeing in the affected aircraft? Yes. The modifications I proposed address the specific resonance frequencies that create the failure cascade. They would have added minimal cost to production and required no significant schedule delays. The company's objection was never technical feasibility. It was timing and quarterly financial targets. The questions continued for 3 hours. Technical queries about servo mechanisms and hydraulic systems. Timeline clarifications about who knew what, when. Pointed questions about the company's response to his concerns, and the pressure applied to keep him quiet. Aaron answered everything with the precision of an engineer and the weariness of someone who'd lived with these truths for too long. During a break, Claire Rowan approached him in the hallway. She looked different than she had on the plane. More formal in a business suit, her hair perfectly styled, every inch the corporate executive. But her eyes held the same intensity, the same determination he'd seen when she'd asked him to help in the cockpit. "You're doing well in there," she said quietly. "Better than well. You're making the case in a way that's irrefutable. I'm just telling the truth. The truth presented with expertise and credibility. That's powerful." She glanced back toward the conference room. "I'm testifying this afternoon about what I found in the company archives, about the internal communications that show systematic suppression of safety concerns. I wanted you to know that I'm not holding anything back. Whatever consequences come for the company, we've earned them. You weren't there 12 years ago. You don't have to fall on your sword for decisions you didn't make. No, but I'm there now, and I have the power to ensure this never happens again within Pacific Northwest Aviation. New policies, new reporting structures, new protections for engineers who raise concerns. I can't change the past, but I can shape the future." She paused. "We'd like to offer you a position heading our new Safety Oversight Division. Full authority to halt production for safety concerns. Direct reporting line to the CEO and the board. Salary commensurate with the importance of the role." Aaron stared at her. "You want to hire me? After everything?" "We want to hire you because of everything, because you were right, because you prioritize safety over career security, because you're exactly the kind of person who should have authority in our organization." Rowan's voice softened. "I know you have no reason to trust the company, but I'm asking you to consider it, to consider whether working from inside the system might be more effective than consulting from outside it." Before Aaron could respond, they were called back into the conference room. The afternoon session focused on the broader implications: the grounded aircraft, the inspection protocols being developed, the timeline for implementing fixes. Aaron's testimony became part of a larger narrative about systemic failures and the need for regulatory reform. By the time they adjourned for the day, Aaron was exhausted in ways that had nothing to do with physical fatigue. He'd excavated 12 years of buried history, laid it out for examination, and watched as people who actually had the power to change things took it seriously. No dismissals, no suggestions that he was overreacting, just detailed questions and careful documentation, and the machinery of federal oversight grinding into motion. Thursday brought meetings with FAA engineers, practical discussions about inspection criteria, and retrofit specifications. Aaron found himself not just answering questions, but actively collaborating, his insights shaping the technical requirements that would govern how the fixes were implemented. This was familiar territory, the kind of engineering work he'd always excelled at, and he felt himself settling into it with a comfort he'd almost forgotten was possible. Friday morning, Morrison found him in one of the technical workrooms, reviewing draft inspection protocols. "I think we've gotten everything we need from you for this phase of the investigation," Morrison said. "The formal report will take a few months to compile, but the preliminary findings are clear. The company failed in its duty to address a known safety concern. The regulatory oversight missed opportunities to identify the problem, and your original assessment was correct in every material aspect." What happens to the company? The FAA is levying fines in the hundreds of millions. The Justice Department is still deciding on criminal charges. The civil lawsuits will probably result in significant settlements. And more importantly, the regulatory framework is being revised to strengthen whistleblower protections and create more robust oversight of how companies handle internal safety reports. Aaron sat back in his chair. "So, something good comes out of all this?" "A lot of good, including this." Morrison pulled out a folder. "I'm authorized to offer you a permanent position as a senior technical consultant with the NTSB. You'd work on aviation safety investigations, provide expert analysis on complex system failures, and serve as a resource for other engineers considering whether to report safety concerns. The position is based in DC, but there's flexibility for remote work and travel to your home location. The salary is competitive, the benefits are federal government standard, and the work would involve exactly the kind of technical problem solving you're obviously passionate about." 2 job offers in 1 week. Aaron thought about what each represented. Pacific Northwest Aviation offered redemption, a chance to reshape the company that had broken him, institutional power to prevent future failures. The NTSB offered independence, federal authority to investigate without corporate pressure, the opportunity to help engineers across the entire industry. "Can I think about it?" Aaron asked. "Of course, no rush." "Well, some rush. We'd like an answer within a couple of weeks. But take the time you need to consider what makes sense for you and your daughter." That evening, Aaron called Mia from his hotel room. She answered on the first ring, her voice bright with excitement. "Daddy, guess what? I got picked for the science fair team at school. Well, Grandma's school, but still. We're going to build a volcano and make it erupt with vinegar and baking soda." Aaron smiled, feeling the tension of the week begin to ease. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. You'll be the best volcano builder they've ever seen. How's your work going? Are you fixing the airplanes?" "I'm helping other people fix the airplanes. And I'm making sure that when engineers notice problems, people listen to them instead of telling them to be quiet." "Like they told you to be quiet?" "Exactly like that." "Good, because being quiet about important things is wrong. Even I know that." After they said goodnight, and Aaron had spoken briefly with Margaret about logistics and timing, he sat at the hotel desk and pulled out his laptop. He drafted 2 emails, one to Claire Rowan and one to Morrison, thanking them for their offers and asking for 2 weeks to make his decision. Both deserved serious consideration. Both represented futures he could imagine building. But before sending those emails, Aaron opened a new message to Jason Chen, the engineer who'd reached out after seeing the news about Flight 447. "I testified this week before the NTSB. I told them everything about the suppression of safety concerns and the institutional failures that enabled disaster. It was hard but necessary. I'm writing to tell you that they listened, really listened. And the system is changing because of it. Whatever you decide about your own situation, know that speaking up matters. Know that there are protections even when it doesn't feel like it. Know that you're not alone. Other engineers are finding their voices because you found yours. The ripples are spreading. Thank you for being part of this." He hit send, then sent the other 2 emails requesting time to decide. The week in DC had been transformative, but Aaron needed to process what it meant before committing to a path forward. He needed to talk to Mia in person, not over the phone. Needed to consider what each option would mean for their life together. The flight home to Seattle Sunday afternoon gave him time to think. He'd booked a window seat and spent the flight watching the country pass beneath him, thinking about the hundreds of aircraft in the sky at any given moment, the millions of passengers who trusted that someone had done the work to keep them safe. That trust was sacred. The people who violated it for profit margins or production schedules or corporate convenience betrayed something fundamental. Aaron had tried to honor that trust 12 years ago and been punished for it. Now he had the opportunity to honor it again, from a position where his voice carried weight and his expertise commanded respect. Margaret and Mia met him at baggage claim, Mia launching herself at him before he'd fully cleared the security exit. He lifted her up, despite her getting too big for it, holding her tight and breathing in the strawberry scent of her shampoo. "I missed you so much," Mia said against his shoulder. "I missed you too, sweetheart. Tell me everything about your week." They went to dinner at Mia's favorite restaurant. The three of them crowded into a booth while Mia chattered about school and friends and the science fair volcano plans. She was animated, happy, thriving in the routine and stability of Margaret's house and her old-school connections. Aaron watched her and saw not just his daughter, but the reason behind every choice he'd made for the past 12 years. After Mia went to bed that night, Aaron and Margaret sat in the living room with tea, the ritual that marked their important conversations. "How was it really?" Margaret asked. "Behind all the professional accomplishment and the job offers, how are you?" Aaron considered the question. Vindicated, exhausted, angry at how long it took, grateful it's finally happening, guilty about the people who died while I was silent, hopeful about what comes next, all of it at once. "That's honest." Margaret sipped her tea. "What are you leaning toward with the job offers?" "I don't know yet. Pacific Northwest Aviation offers the chance to fix the company from inside to prevent future failures at the source. But working for the company that destroyed my career feels like swallowing poison even if it's been reformulated. The NTSB offers independence and the chance to help across the whole industry, but it means starting over in DC or dealing with constant travel away from Mia." "Have you asked Mia what she thinks?" "She's 6. I can't put that kind of decision on her. I'm not suggesting you let her decide. I'm suggesting you include her in the conversation. She's more perceptive than you give her credit for, and she deserves to know that her opinion matters in decisions that affect her life." The next morning, Aaron took Mia to their favorite park, the one with the good swings and the view of Puget Sound. They swung side by side, the rhythm soothing and familiar. "Can I ask you something important?" Aaron said as their swings synchronized. "Like grown-up important?" "Like family important. I got 2 job offers in Washington, D.C. Both of them would mean doing work I really care about, helping keep airplanes safe. But they're both in different cities from where we live now." Mia dragged her feet to slow her swing, processing this information with her characteristic seriousness. "Would we have to move?" "Maybe. Or I might have to travel a lot for work. Or we might figure out a different arrangement. I'm still working through the options." "Do you want to do the work?" "I do. More than I've wanted to do any work in a very long time." "Then you should do it. We'll figure out the rest. You're always telling me that sometimes we have to do hard things because they're important. This is one of those times, right?" Aaron stopped his swing completely, looking at his daughter in wonder. When had she become this wise? "Right. This is one of those times. Then we'll make it work. Maybe Grandma could move closer to us. Or maybe we could move here and I could go to school where my friends are. Or maybe you could work from home sometimes and travel sometimes, and we'd figure it out like we figure everything out." The simplicity of her logic cut through all of Aaron's complicated analysis. They'd figure it out. Like they'd figured out life after Sarah died. Like they'd figured out how to make ends meet on a technical writer's salary. Like they'd figured out how to survive an emergency landing and come out stronger on the other side. Over the next week, Aaron worked through the logistics with both Morrison and Rowan, exploring flexible arrangements and remote work possibilities. The NTSB was willing to let him work primarily from Seattle with periodic travel to DC for hearings and investigations. Pacific Northwest Aviation was restructuring their safety division with satellite offices and could establish a presence in Seattle if that's what it took to bring him on board. The decision crystallized on a Thursday evening when Aaron attended a town hall meeting organized by a local pilots union. They'd invited him to speak about Flight 447 and the investigation, and Aaron had accepted despite his discomfort with public speaking. The room was packed with pilots, flight attendants, mechanics, engineers, people who worked in aviation and understood the stakes involved. Aaron stood at the front and told his story, not as a victim, but as someone who'd learned hard lessons about the cost of silence and the power of speaking up. When he finished, the questions came rapidly. How could they report safety concerns without jeopardizing their careers? What protections existed? What had changed since his experience 12 years ago? Aaron answered each one, drawing on what he'd learned during his week with the NTSB, providing practical guidance born from hard experience. Afterward, a young woman approached him. She introduced herself as a newly certified aircraft mechanic, fresh out of school and full of idealism about her chosen profession. "I just want to say thank you," she said. "I graduate from my program next month, and I've been nervous about what happens when I see something wrong and management doesn't want to hear it. Hearing your story, knowing that the system can eventually work if people are brave enough to use it, that gives me hope." Aaron looked at this young mechanic, at her earnest face and determined expression, and saw the future of aviation safety, not in the regulations being rewritten or the inspection protocols being implemented, but in the people who choose courage over convenience because they'd seen that speaking up mattered. That night, Aaron drafted his responses to both job offers. To Claire Rowan, he sent a respectful decline, acknowledging the significance of her offer, but explaining that he needed independence from the company to be effective. Working inside Pacific Northwest Aviation would always carry the weight of history, would always create questions about whether his judgments were truly objective or influenced by institutional loyalty. To Morrison, he accepted the NTSB position with the negotiated flexibility for remote work. The federal government moved slowly with hiring, so the official start date was 2 months out, giving Aaron time to provide notice at his current job, make arrangements for Mia's schooling, and prepare for the transition. The news of his decision made national aviation news. The whistleblower who'd predicted the flaw joining the NTSB to prevent future failures. It was a neat narrative, the kind that journalists loved and that Aaron tried not to think about too much. The reality was messier than the headlines suggested, full of compromises and practical considerations and the daily work of living up to the trust people were placing in him. 6 weeks later, Aaron stood in his new NTSB office in Seattle, the satellite workspace they'd established specifically to accommodate his arrangement. The office was modest but functional, with the same kind of technical references and simulation software he'd used during his years at Pacific Northwest Aviation. But this time, he answered only to the truth, only to the data, only to the imperative to keep people safe. Mia had enrolled in a school near Margaret's house, close enough that her grandmother could help with pickup and homework on the days Aaron traveled to D.C. The arrangement wasn't perfect. Aaron missed tucking her in every night when he was away, but it worked. They video called every evening he was gone. He came home to detailed reports of science fair progress and friend drama and everything that filled a 6-year-old's life. On a Saturday morning, 2 months into his new position, Aaron woke to Mia jumping on his bed, all elbows and energy and excitement. "Daddy, wake up! It's my birthday, and you promised we could do anything I want." Aaron had indeed promised that, had circled this date on his calendar since accepting the NTSB position. Mia's 7th birthday, the first one since Flight 447, since everything had changed. What does the birthday girl want to do? "I want to go to the air show. There's one at the museum and they have real planes you can sit in and pilots who talk about flying and everything." Aaron's chest tightened. Of all the possible birthday requests, of course she'd choose this. But he looked at her shining eyes and remembered her courage on Flight 447, her simple wisdom about being brave, her faith that he could do hard things when they mattered. "Then that's what we'll do," he said. "Air show it is." They spent the day at the Museum of Flight, surrounded by historic aircraft and aviation enthusiasts. Mia climbed into a vintage cockpit and pretended to fly. Asking Aaron technical questions he answered with the expertise of someone who'd spent his entire professional life understanding these machines. They watched demonstrations and talked to pilots and ate overpriced museum food with enthusiasm. As the afternoon wound down, they found themselves in an exhibit about aviation safety. There were displays about accident investigations, about the incremental improvements that made modern flight possible, about the engineers and inspectors and pilots who worked behind the scenes to keep passengers safe. In the corner of the exhibit, Aaron saw a new addition that hadn't been there on his previous visits. A small display about Flight 447, about the emergency landing in Billings and the investigation that followed. There was a photo of the aircraft, a timeline of events, and a brief explanation of the servo resonance flaw that had been discovered and corrected. And there, in a sidebar about the importance of engineers speaking up about safety concerns, was Aaron's name. "Daddy, that's you!" Mia pointed at the display with delight. "You're in the museum!" Aaron read the text, feeling strange seeing his professional history condensed into a few paragraphs. It was accurate but incomplete, missing the weight of the years in between, the personal cost behind the professional vindication. "Why does it make you sad?" Mia asked, watching his face. "It doesn't make me sad exactly. Just thoughtful. All of this took a very long time to happen, and along the way some people got hurt who didn't need to if things had been different." Mia slipped her hand into his. "But now it's better. Now other people won't get hurt because you made them listen. That's what matters, right? Out of the mouths of children, again and always, the simple truth that cut through complexity." "That's exactly what matters," Aaron agreed. They left the museum as the sun began to set, painting the Seattle sky in shades of orange and gold. Overhead, aircraft approached SeaTac Airport in steady succession, their landing lights bright against the gathering dusk. Aaron watched them and felt something he hadn't felt in years: pride in the work, trust in the systems, confidence that when those planes touched down, it would be because hundreds of people had done their jobs with integrity and care. That evening, Margaret hosted a birthday dinner with a cake she'd spent all afternoon decorating to look like an airplane. Mia blew out her candles and made a wish she refused to reveal, maintaining the birthday tradition with 7-year-old seriousness. They ate cake and opened presents and did all the normal things that marked a child's birthday. After Mia went to bed, Aaron stepped outside onto Margaret's back porch, needing a moment of quiet after the day's festivities. He pulled out his phone and saw an email from Morrison. "Thought you'd want to know. The final NTSB report on Flight 447 was released this afternoon. It fully validates your original findings and makes 17 recommendations for regulatory reform. The FAA has accepted 15 of them and is considering the other 2. More importantly, we're getting calls from engineers at 3 other manufacturers who saw the report and want to discuss safety concerns they've been hesitant to raise. Your work is creating exactly the ripple effect we hoped for." Aaron read the email twice, then looked up at the sky where stars were beginning to appear between scattered clouds. Somewhere up there, aircraft were carrying passengers who'd never know how close they'd come to disaster, who'd never think about the engineers and investigators and reformed systems that kept them safe. That anonymity was how it should be. Safety should be invisible, felt only in its absence. But for the people who did the work, who made the hard choices, who spoke up when silence would have been easier, for them, there needed to be acknowledgement, protection, support. The knowledge that doing the right thing wouldn't destroy everything they'd built. Aaron thought about the young mechanic at the town hall, about Jason Chen finding his courage, about the engineers calling the NTSB, because they'd seen what happened when someone spoke up and survived. The last seat on Flight 447 had been the beginning of something larger than one emergency landing, larger than one investigation, larger than one engineer's vindication. It had been the moment when silence broke, and truth found a voice that couldn't be dismissed. The screen door creaked and Margaret joined him on the porch, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders against the evening chill. "She had a wonderful birthday," Margaret said. "Thank you for making it special despite everything else you're juggling. She deserves every bit of special I can give her." "You know what Sarah would say if she were here? She'd say she was proud of you, not for the NTSB position or the vindication or any of the professional recognition. She'd be proud that you taught Mia what integrity looks like, that you showed her how to be brave when it mattered, that you chose truth over comfort even when it was terrifying." Aaron's eyes burned. He'd thought about Sarah constantly during the investigation, wondering what she'd think of the choices he'd made, whether she'd understand the years of silence or judge him for not fighting harder sooner. "I wish she could have seen how it turned out," Aaron said quietly. "She sees it. In Mia's courage and your conviction and the lives that are safer because you refuse to stay silent. She sees it all." They stood together in the cool Seattle evening, watching the occasional aircraft pass overhead, their navigation lights tracing paths across the darkening sky. Each plane represented hundreds of passengers trusting in systems and people they'd never meet. Each flight was an act of faith that someone somewhere had done the work to make the journey safe. Aaron had been that someone once, then was punished for it, then found his way back to being that someone again. The path had been longer and harder than it needed to be, but it had led here. To meaningful work. To a daughter who understood integrity. To a future where speaking up was protected rather than punished. The last seat on Flight 447 had seemed like the worst luck when Aaron had boarded that afternoon. The seat nobody wanted, at the back of the plane, squeezed against the lavatories with no recline and limited space. But that seat had put him exactly where he needed to be when crisis struck. That seat had given him a second chance to make his expertise matter. That seat had been the beginning of everything that followed. Standing on Margaret's porch with aircraft passing overhead and his daughter sleeping safely inside, Aaron finally understood that sometimes the worst seat is actually the best one. Sometimes the position nobody else wants is exactly where you belong. Sometimes the path that seems like punishment is actually preparation for something larger. The last seat had saved more than just one flight. It had saved Aaron's sense of purpose, had restored his voice, had proven that truth could survive even when it took 12 years to be fully heard. And on a cool Seattle evening, with his daughter's birthday cake still sitting on the kitchen counter and stars beginning to pierce the darkening sky, Aaron Blake allowed himself to believe that the hard years hadn't been wasted. They'd been necessary. Every moment of silence had made the speaking up that much more powerful. Every year of exile had made the return that much more meaningful. The last seat had become the first chapter of a different story. Not a tragedy of silence and suppression, but a testament to resilience and redemption and the stubborn belief that safety mattered more than schedules, that truth mattered more than profit, that speaking up mattered even when the cost seemed unbearable. Aaron went back inside, checked on Mia one more time, and settled at Margaret's kitchen table with his laptop. There were emails to answer, reports to review, the ongoing work of making aviation safer one investigation at a time. The work would never be finished. There would always be new challenges, new systems to evaluate, new engineers who needed encouragement to speak up. But for tonight, it was enough to know that the work was happening, that the system was changing, that the last seat on Flight 447 had been exactly where it needed to be. Outside, planes continued their steady approach to SeaTac, their paths guided by technology and training and the accumulated wisdom of engineers who'd spoken up when it mattered. Inside, a father worked late while his daughter slept, building a safer future one technical assessment at a time. The last seat had changed everything. And everything, finally, was exactly as it should be.